By the age of 21, Owney Madden had left 5 rivals dead in Hell's Kitchen's bloody gang wars of 1914, earning him the chilling nickname of the Killer. A decade later, Prohibition turned men like Madden into millionaires, and he was crowned the Duke of the West Side, cementing his grip on New York's underworld. English-born and Irish-blooded, Madden became an enduring American legend. Elusive and enigmatic, he avoided cameras, shunned the press, and even inspired the mysterious character of Jay Gatsby. A name few recognised, but a man impossible to ignore. His story is one of power, violence and ambition, a tale that reshaped New York's vibrant streets and its dazzling nightlife. From his bloody rise in the alleys of Hell's Kitchen to owning the legendary Cotton Club, Madden orchestrated the rhythms of the Jazz Age. He mingled with stars, raised pigeons on its rooftop, and courted the iconic Mae West, all while reigning as the unchallenged king of New York's nightlife. This is the untold story of Owney the Killer Madden, a man whose influence was unmatched, yet whose name remains a ghost in history's shadows. Once you've heard his story, you'll never forget his name. Owen Vincent Madden entered the world on December 18, 1891, born in a modest terraced house on Somerset Street in Leeds, England, to Irish immigrants Francis and Mary Madden. Owney's early life was shaped by the enduring hardships of his parents' generation, many of whom had fled Ireland's devastating potato famine to find work in England's industrial towns. For Francis, like countless other Irishmen of the time, the northern English mills promised steady employment, but at the cost of back-breaking hours and meagre wages. Young Owney watched his father return each evening, drained and weary from long shifts, where his days were spent pressing, cutting wool and loading heavy rolls onto horse-drawn carts. Through these observations, Owney developed a lasting distaste for the grueling toll of manual labour. He would later boast to a New York policeman that he had never worked a day in his life. Evenings at the Madden residence on Somerset Street brought rare moments of reprieve. The family would gather around the modest coal fire, Francis stoking its reluctant warmth, Mary carefully darning clothes, while Owney and his siblings played on the rug. In these fleeting, humble scenes, there lingered a small echo of the family's Irish heritage. In pursuit of a better life, the Maddens moved westward across the Pennines to Wigan, a town choked by the yellow haze of smoke and the heavy, hacking cough of labourers. In Wigan, each day began with the rattle of carts on cobbled streets, the whirring machinery of mills and mines, and rows of soot-stained cottages that crept up the hills. These scenes of hardship etched a permanent mark on Owney, who would later recall the bleakness of his childhood in Wigan. The public school he attended was as severe as the landscape itself, with stern teachers and a polished cane ready to strike as they drilled the students. When the school bell finally released him, Owney found solace in tending his father's pigeons. He would scatter grain for them, clean the tiny loft, and set them free. Watching the birds soar in graceful, synchronised circles over the rooftops against the misty backdrop of the moors became, for Owney, an escape from the murky surroundings he found himself in. One day, as though drawn by some magnetic pull toward Ireland, Francis announced another move, this time 25 miles west to Liverpool. The city, bustling with fellow Irish immigrants and faces from every corner of the globe, was vibrant with the energy of its cosmopolitan port and a spirit of resilient optimism. Much like New York, Liverpool was a cultural melting pot where poverty was met with humour and tenacity. The locals, quick-witted and ever ready with a self-deprecating quip, could have blended easily into the lively crowds of the Big Apple. In Liverpool, Owney had a brief stint as a child entertainer in the lively world of music halls. Francis and Mary sought to escape the grinding monotony of their daily lives by teaching young Owney an unrefined song and dance routine, hoping to bring in a little extra income. This was the same era when future legends like Stan Laurel and Charlie Chaplin were performing clog dances and slapstick routines. There was something undeniably magnetic about the world of show business, a charm and ease that Owney gravitated towards and embraced. Meanwhile, his father had taken a job in a fish mill, grinding down the day's catch into fish meal at the dockside. To Owney, the glamour of theatre and music halls was a welcome escape from the harsh realities of industrial labour, which he already held in contempt. Owney's boyhood in Liverpool was also electrified by the thrill and fleeting fortune of the boxing ring. Though too young to throw punches himself, he spent countless hours watching his uncle fight for cash prizes in smoky halls and makeshift boxing booths. Owney lingered around the dressing rooms, much like he did backstage at the music halls, immersing himself in a world that felt miles away from the hard grind of daily life outside. Liverpool was Owney's kind of town. From the waterfront, he could witness the full range of life in a single glance, from the well-dressed and affluent to the gritty and struggling. But Liverpool had little sympathy for those leaving its harsh embrace. Along the 5-mile stretch of waterfront, dockside boarding houses crammed side by side preyed ruthlessly on impoverished immigrants. The quayside bustled with low-life opportunists of every kind, from shady money changers peddling worthless currency to quick-fingered urchins weaving through the crowd, ready to snatch what they could. In 1902, 11-year-old Owney stood on this same dock with his mother, brother Marty, and sister Mary, the same spot where his father Francis had once arrived on an Irish packet boat filled with hope for a new life. Francis had long dreamed of bringing his family to America, but after finally saving enough for the fare, he passed away before they could make the journey. Undeterred, Mary found the courage to carry forward his vision, braving the unknown to fulfill his dream. She knew that if she failed to find work, there was still a chance that her sister Lizzie in Manhattan would offer a roof and support. Owney, even at this young age, took on the role of family protector, fiercely guarding their bundles and preparing himself to fight off gangs of street kids that swarmed the docks, drawn to easy prey. Owney's last view of Liverpool was one of sunlit masts and rigging rising along the waterfront, glowing in the late afternoon light. As they inched along the landing stage, a crowded tender filled with passengers began its journey toward the waiting silhouette of the SS Teutonic anchored offshore. Leaving Liverpool was hard enough, but nothing prepared the passengers for their arrival in New York 38 days later. Weak, cold and hungry, they faced fresh dangers similar to those they'd left behind. Thieves, cheats, and the ever-present risk of losing their belongings. In the year the Maddens crossed the Atlantic, 195,000 other immigrants from England faced the same struggles and hardships. As Owney stepped off the gangplank, hoisting his family's luggage, he quickly learned the first rule of the promised land: survive or perish. In the dangerous path that lay ahead, Owney would earn a reputation as one who not only survived but outlived nearly all of his rivals. The family settled at 478 10th Avenue in the heart of Hell's Kitchen, a neighbourhood that stretched north and south of 34th Street, notorious for its crime-riddled streets and its reputation as the roughest part of New York. Mae Madden, a proud and principled Irish woman, struggled to raise her children with the values she held dear in such a turbulent environment. Owney, the quieter of the two boys, held on to his English upbringing, a stark contrast to his older brother Martin, or Marty, as the kids on the block called him, who quickly blended into life as a true New Yorker. Owney's roots were never far from him. At 12, Owney would leave the stone steps of number 478 every day, walking to St. Michael's Parochial School on West 33rd Street. The newly built flat-iron building could be seen towering in the distance, rising 22 miraculous stories above Madison Square, but on many days, Owney simply didn't make it to school. The bustling streets held more appeal, and instead of classrooms, he spent his time near livery stables and gyms, running errands for local criminals, receiving his lessons on the sidewalks of the Lower West Side. The scramble for survival taught him quickly, and although the Maddens had been one of the few families in the neighbourhood to steer clear of crime, Mary knew that temptation was close at hand. She often reminded her sons of their father's belief that the new world promised everyone a fair chance, and that with honest work, they could succeed. But New York's poorer quarters had their own brutal reality. Corruption seeped through every layer of daily life, from food prices controlled by racketeers to police officers and politicians who were often as ruthless as the gangs. In Hell's Kitchen, if you wanted the American dream, you either found your break in show business or joined the mob. Mary did what she could, working long hours scrubbing floors to feed her family. But no matter how hard she worked, her children remained pale and undernourished, and she could only hope that Owney, who was growing into his teenage years with a sharp mind and a budding sense of responsibility, would steer clear of dishonesty. "On your father's grave, Owney," she told him, "I'll have no dishonest money in this house." One day, as Owney helped Mary carry groceries home, they were jolted by the swiftness of a young thief, a boy Owney's age, who darted past, slashing the handle of Mary's bag and disappearing with their hard-earned groceries. Owney watched his mother's frustration as she fumed over the loss, her voice angry as they walked home. He carried the remaining bag, turning the incident over in his mind, realising how easily the boy had made off with their food. This was the first time he fully grasped that crime could pay, and thought to himself, "I could do that, and better too." The experience was a turning point, one of the first that shaped his view on life. At barely 14, driven by a desire to lift his family from the hardships they faced, Owney began to form a plan. With determination and a resolve born of hunger and desperation, he would commit his first crime. He armed himself with a club and waited in the shadows of a darkened doorway for his target to pass by. The targeted man had spent all afternoon in a Hell's Kitchen saloon and was sufficiently intoxicated. When the man finally approached the doorway, alone and unsuspecting, Owney struck, knocking him out cold. The man had $500 on him, and Owney took only the cash, leaving everything else untouched. He knew he couldn't simply hand it over to his mother. She'd demand to know where it all came from, and he couldn't risk that. Instead, he gave small amounts to his Aunt Lizzie, who, in turn, lent it to his mother. Owney's first crime revealed the beginnings of a distinct Madden approach that only sharpened with time. Naturally quiet, even shy, he always seemed to take the unexpected route, catching others off guard with his subtlety. Friends, attorneys, hard-nosed journalists, and underworld associates alike noted his calm, unassuming demeanour. Unlike the headline-hungry gangsters who thrived on bravado, Owney's toughness came from within. A foundation shaped by the grit of the Lancashire coalfields, the rough docks of Liverpool, and the unforgiving streets of Hell's Kitchen. Drawn to the allure of easy money, 14-year-old Owney Madden stood on the brink of a violent path marked by murder, ballot rigging, and robbery that would carry him to the top of New York's most notorious street gang, the Gophers. Known as the Killer, a moniker he would despise his entire life, Owney quickly earned a fearsome reputation. A faded photograph captures him in a Hell's Kitchen back alley with his fellow Gopher gang members, with pigeons scattered in the foreground. Sitting at the centre of the crew, Owney radiates the intensity of a young thug, prepared to bulldoze anyone or anything in his way. The Gophers earned their name by gathering in basements and cellars like their underground namesakes. Owney Madden, though proudly English, had Irish roots that were good enough for the Gophers' ranks. While his background may have seemed unusual in the strict codes of Hell's Kitchen, it was still far better than being Jewish or Italian. Small and wiry with an edgy, self-assured demeanour, Owney quickly won their respect. He built his early reputation wielding an old-fashioned weapon, a length of lead pipe wrapped in newspaper, a unique tool in Hell's Kitchen that left an impression. However, what truly set him apart was that by age 15, Owney was one of the rare West Side menaces to carry a gun, a .38 Smith & Wesson, which he used with deadly precision. The East and West Side knew him as the finest shot in New York, and only after World War I did firearms become a more common sight on the streets as returning soldiers brought weaponry skills back home. Until then, the gophers held their turf with clubs, knives, brass knuckles and blackjacks, fighting off rival gangs like the Gas Houses, Five Pointers, 14th Street Gang and the Hudson Dusters. In a crisis, the gophers could rally up to 500 fighters to defend their territory, often in bloody clashes over loot from freight cars they had stolen. Owney assumed leadership of the gophers, who were recruiting young punks from the neighbourhood into their ranks. One budding member, George Raft, future Hollywood star, recalled a memorable night with the gophers. It was their weekly night out, and one by one, they emerged from the dimly lit pool halls and crowded apartments along the gaslit streets off 10th Avenue, gathering outside the neighbourhood Nickelodeon. Some sported caps and roll-neck jerseys, others wore beat-up derbies and collarless shirts, all unified by their side-laced boots, a signature look for the gang. Tonight, the toughest boys on the West Side were on home turf, unwinding in their own way, eager for the novelty of the cinema. Movies were still fresh entertainment, and they rarely missed a new one, whether it was about cops and robbers or daring romances. This night's feature was Les Miserables, though none of them could quite pronounce the title. George Raft was the only outsider with them, a young guy from just up the block. He'd had his share of rough times, having left home early and bounced from picking fruit upstate to boxing for a spell. George was a friend of Owney's, which meant he was welcome among the gang. He liked spending time with the gophers, but his dreams extended beyond their world of raiding freight cars in the New York Central train yards. At 21, Owney was 5 years older than George and respected the kid's grit and loyalty. Occasionally, he'd slip George a wad of cash, knowing he was sleeping rough. George, careful and proud, always counted it and made a point of paying Owney back. Like many Hell's Kitchen kids, George tried to emulate Owney's understated toughness and dignified presence. They were both a bit different from the rough Irish crowd under Owney's command. When Les Miserables flickered onto the screen, George, with a bit of shame, tried to hide the fact that he was deeply moved by it. George couldn't contain his emotions and started to sob. His tough pals roared with laughter, and the experience taught him to mask his feelings in front of them. George's honesty endeared him to Owney, the emotion of the film also resonating with the gang leader. One of the aforementioned brutes laughing at George in the movie theatre was Jack Diamond, known as Legs. Legs idolised Owney and hung around the gophers, running errands and begging to join their nightly raids in New York. To prove his worth, Legs took to stealing parcels from delivery wagons, running through the streets faster than anyone had seen. Owney tolerated him, good-naturedly, but only just. After a night at the movies, Madden would leisurely wander down 41st Street, the very core of Irish gang turbulence. A familiar figure on these streets, he walked with his chest puffed like one of his father's pigeons back in Wigan, or a lord surveying his domain. His swagger once led a veteran sergeant at the West 37th Street police station, the notorious Hell's Kitchen precinct, to label him a banty little rooster from hell. As he strolled, Madden observed everything, tracking faces in the crowd and noting which shops had changed hands. He absorbed every detail with the sharp, vigilant eye of a survivor. The drive to know every detail of his surroundings consumed him. At home, he'd pore over the newspapers, meticulously marking anything that piqued his interest, setting clippings aside for future reference. The Hell's Kitchen precinct was infamous as one of the city's most violent posts. Locals called it the slaughterhouse, due to the endless shouts and clashes that erupted into the night as officers sparred with rebellious young bruisers, keeping their edge sharp. Many officers, often of Irish descent themselves, fought an unrelenting battle to maintain order against the fierce warlords of sprawling gangs. Protection rackets thrived openly, homes were looted in broad daylight, and anyone carrying so much as a few dollars risked being clubbed to the ground by thugs eager to claim it. For the gophers, steady work was a joke. They spent their days idling, waiting for dance halls and theatres to open, or for nightfall to shield their raids. Owney, no stranger to the Hell's Kitchen precinct house, was said to have been arrested over 140 times, yet convicted only twice. On one occasion, a sergeant, egged on by a curious reporter, asked Owney to account for his recent movements. Indulging them, Owney scribbled on a police pad. Thursday, went to a dance in the afternoon, went to a dance at night and then to a cabaret, took some girls home, went to a restaurant and stayed there until 7 o'clock Friday morning. Friday, spent the day with a girl, looked at some fancy pigeons, met some friends in a saloon early in the evening and stayed with them until 5 o'clock in the morning. Saturday, slept all day, went to a dance in the Bronx late in the afternoon and to a dance on Park Avenue at night. Sunday, slept until 3 o'clock, went to a dance in the afternoon and to another in the same place at night. After that, I went to a cabaret and stayed there almost all night. Naturally, there was no mention of any crime. One of Owney's steady girlfriends was Frida Horner, a blonde with bobbed hair who was part of the gang scene and considered a moll, one of the tough, loyal women with gang tattoos and a reputation for fighting off police. Frida carried Owney's gun in her clutch, ready for any police encounter. She was drawn to his rising status and appreciated that he was a more attentive partner than his rowdy associates. Madden had a magnetic charm. Ladies who heard of him were thrilled at meeting him. To some, he appeared cute. His hair was black and sleek. His eyes were blue, a very bright and piercing blue. Sometimes they were friendly enough, and at rest they were even sad, but usually they were hard and shining, and they saw everything. Owney often brought Frida or other dancehall flings back to his apartment, but Frida had multiple partners and, like her friend Margaret Everdeen, eventually contracted syphilis. Medical records from Bellevue Hospital noted Frida's case as non-infectious, but Margaret required more extensive treatment. Owney's relationship with Frida cooled when he married Dorothy Rogers in May 1911. For a while, they lived at 656 10th Avenue, where Dorothy gave birth to a daughter, Margaret. However, their marriage was short-lived. Dorothy, unable to tolerate Owney's chaotic life, moved in with her mother on West 42nd Street. Though they remained married on paper, their paths diverged and they didn't see each other again. Frida Horner re-entered Owney's life when Dorothy returned to live with her mother. Frida had left a volatile gunman named Patsy Doyle to be with Owney again, and for a while things seemed to return to how they once were. However, trouble was on the horizon for the gang. The Gophers had pushed the patience of the New York Central Railroad Company to the limit. The gang's raids had stolen thousands of dollars in freight and left several railroad guards injured. When the police proved either unable or unwilling to curb the Gophers' activity, New York Central took matters into its own hands. Under a shroud of secrecy, the company formed a formidable security team, handpicked for their readiness to take on the gang. Some of these men were settling old scores, while others were eager to break the monotony of freight yard duty with a full-blown fight. In a planned assault, the railroad security force divided into teams and swept through Hell's Kitchen, storming gopher hideouts and delivering brutal beatings with nightsticks. The neighbourhood turned into a war zone as residents fled. When some gophers, following Owney's lead, pulled out guns, they were shocked to be met with precise return fire. The railroad guards had trained for just such a confrontation. The sustained assault over the next few weeks finally broke the Gophers' resistance. Observing the relentless attack, one patrolman remarked that the gophers had been clubbed from hell to breakfast. Owney fought fiercely in the clashes, yet somehow escaped arrest. The gophers, now shattered, held a meeting and decided to divide their ranks, with Owney's second in command, one Lung Curran leading one faction and Owney the other. After the ranks were split up, rival gangs began to circle like vultures, hoping to claim territory from what they saw as a weakened gopher faction. Realizing his leadership was being tested, Owney bought some time by striking a truce with Tanner Smith, the head of the Marginals gang who controlled territory just south of Hell's Kitchen. Even the Hodson Dusters, the Gophers' most fierce adversaries, expressed interest in a similar agreement. However, Owney refused peace with the Dusters, engaging in fierce street battles with them. New York was now a city in transition, with gangs vying for control of neighborhoods and occasionally sparking shootouts in the street. In a bold warning to the Hudson Dusters, and to cement his reputation with his gang, Owney gunned down a young Italian Hudson Duster named Luigi Molinucci on the corner of 11th Avenue and 30th Street in September 1911. He walked up to the sidewalk and in plain sight of passers-by fired the deadly shot. It was a ruthless act and detectives felt certain they finally had enough to put him away. Yet, as the weeks went by, the case unravelled when key witnesses mysteriously left the neighbourhood, forcing the authorities to drop the charges. Owney, arrested for homicide, walked free. Owney had a reputation for issuing fierce warnings to his rivals, especially when it came to women he considered his. Madden was girl happy. Any girl he knew was his girl. Any man who made a pass at his girl was beaten senseless. By February 1912, as head of the Gophers and ruler over much of New York's West Side, only a fool or someone clueless about the criminal world would cross Owney when it came to his affections. One such man was William Henshaw, a clerk who had been warned by Owney but either ignored or misunderstood the threat. Owney waited as Henshaw dropped the girl in question off at her home in uptown Manhattan, then followed him as he boarded a trolley. As it passed the corner of 16th Street and 9th Avenue, Owney stepped on, drew his Smith & Wesson and shot Henshaw in front of shocked passengers. Before leaving, he rang the trolley's brass bell, a chilling final act, before vanishing into the night. Henshaw was taken to a New York hospital where he identified Owney as his attacker before succumbing to his injuries. The police believed they had an airtight case against Owney, but once again, key witnesses mysteriously left town and he was released on bail. After 2 murders in 5 months, Owney was solidifying his future nicknames of the Killer and the Duke of the West Side. Between 1912 and 1914, Owney built the Gophers into the most dominant gang on the West Side. After the intense clashes with railroad security, he sought a secure headquarters and began expanding the gang's rackets beyond looting freight. Owney's recent close calls with prison made him cautious. He began to keep a low profile, delegating work to trusted members of the Gophers. Happy Jack Mulroney, called so because he constantly looked like he was smiling but actually had facial paralysis. One Lung Curran, who, as you can guess, only had one lung due to a birth defect, and Stumpy Malarkey, who lost half his leg whilst attempting to loot one of the many freight cars the gang robbed, took a more hands-on role in the gang. This deadly trio managed new rackets across the West Side, bringing Owney a lucrative income of $200 daily, around $6,000 today. For the Maddens, the American dream was taking shape in a way they'd never imagined. Mary Madden, proud of her son's loyalty to the family, chose to look past his criminal dealings and welcomed the dishonest money with open arms. Teaming up with his ally Tanner Smith of the Marginals, Owney searched for a headquarters and ultimately selected a suite of rooms above a blacksmith shop on the corner of West 47th Street and 10th Avenue. They transformed it into a bar and restaurant called the Winona Club, solidifying their presence and influence in the neighbourhood. Owney maintained a small apartment next door at 668 10th Avenue, complete with a pigeon loft on the roof. Caring for his prized birds became so demanding that he paid fellow gopher Marty Brennan $75 a week to handle their feeding and cleaning. Owney liked pigeons almost as much as he liked women. In his spare time, he would tinker with the nests or take them out for flights. All the gangsters in Hell's Kitchen knew Owney's pigeons were off limits. You could kill a Hudson duster, but leave Owney's birds alone. He even lacked the heart to eat squab, which was domestic pigeon meat and frequently on the menu in many early 20th century Hell's Kitchen tenement homes. In the realm of West Side power, only one man rivaled Owney's influence, Jimmy Hines, a blacksmith turned city alderman. Their paths crossed as both men were rising in their respective careers. Owney recognised early on the immense advantage of having a well-oiled political machine that controlled the police and judiciary. In New York, this meant the Democrats, and Hines was their shining star. While party politics were secondary, personalities and power took centre stage. Though ambitious, Hines was a different character than Owney, yet their backgrounds and worldviews were strikingly similar. Hines, like Owney, was a man who commanded loyalty from others by giving loyalty. He was steadfast in his friendships and consistently willing to lend a helping hand. Hines believed he had done a lot of good in his lifetime, and a significant portion of his money was given away to the poor of Hell's Kitchen, covering food, coal, rent, and many other necessities. Electioneering in the rough and tumble era before World War I was a violent street-level affair. Hines was determined to take the influential district leader position from a tough Irish plasterer named Jimmy Ahern, who was equally resolved to hold on to it. Their bitter rivalry ignited in 1907, with Hines suffering two narrow defeats before a decisive showdown in 1912. With Owney's strategic insights, Hines approached his 1912 campaign with the fundamental principle of West Side political warfare. The more an opponent's mobster resources are crippled before election day, the less chance they have of winning at the polls. Armed with Owney's street-savvy tactics, Hines achieved a resounding victory, outpacing his opponent by 1,500 votes. With his success in the Hines victory, Owney, now dubbed the Duke of the West Side by all in New York City, was called upon by the Democrats to help influence the West Side to vote for Big Bill Taft, who was running for the 1912 presidential election. As the time came to secure the ballot boxes, Owney found himself in a sour mood as the Democratic chances were slim. To complicate matters further, his girlfriend Frieda Horner was growing increasingly frustrated with their lack of time together and insisted he abandon his duties to take her out instead. With celebrations of a new president planned throughout New York, she was eager to join in. When Owney informed her it was out of the question, Frieda angrily declared that she was going to an election party at the Arbor dance hall with whoever the hell I like. Her announcement was intended to provoke her neglectful partner, especially since the Arbor was well outside the Gophers' territory and a known favourite of the Hudson Dusters. Owney lingered until the West Side vote counting began, sinking deeper into despair over the Democrats' local performance. He eventually returned to the Winona Club for a drink before heading to his apartment to change. The room was simply furnished with a bed and minimal furniture, featuring little of note to an unobservant visitor, except perhaps for a punching bag suspended in the corner. Eventually, Owney made his way uptown to the Arbor Dance Hall. The venue had been a popular gathering spot since it was known as the El Dorado and had recently been refurbished under new management, reportedly thriving more than ever. On November the 6th, 1912, a festive election party atmosphere permeated the city. Frieda was already at the Arbor Dance Hall, located on the corner of West 51st Street and 7th Avenue, when Owney arrived, and she was brazenly flirting with numerous Hudson Dusters, called so because of their fondness for cocaine. Owney's entrance caused a stir. He was rarely seen alone outside gopher territory and clearly wasn't in a festive mood. Couples on the dance floor paused and he waved to them, saying, "Go on and have your fun. I won't bump anybody off here tonight." Making his way to the balcony overlooking the dance floor, he watched Frida enjoy herself. She was in her best clothes, reported the New York Morning Sun the following day, and she danced every dance that came along. She saw Owney and he saw her, but they didn't speak. After selecting a table on the balcony, various small-time mobsters stopped by briefly to pay their respects to Owney and share comments about the dancers below. By around 2 a.m, they had dispersed, and an attractive girl approached and sat beside him. As she chatted charmingly in obvious admiration, Owney was unaware that the occupants of the adjoining tables had been quietly replaced by 11 members of the Hudson Dusters. Once the girl discreetly left for the downstairs dance floor, Owney found himself surrounded on 3 sides by a chilling crescent of familiar faces. He knew they intended to kill him and would shoot before he could even make a move toward his pocket. Aware that his chances of escape were slim, the banty little rooster from hell rose to his feet with bravado and surveyed the group. "Come on, you guys. You couldn't shoot anybody. Who did you ever bump off?" The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment the Hudson Dusters fell silent. Then one of them shouted a curse at Owney, and in an instant all 11 men drew their guns, firing at point-blank range. As the Duke of the West Side crumpled beneath the table, they quickly pocketed their weapons and strolled calmly downstairs and into the night. Despite the chaos, no one in the bustling dance hall intervened. A rush of bouncers and waiters found Owney doubled over on the floor, reported the New York Morning Sun, which had the story on the streets within 2 hours. Men and women were standing just feet away from him, but no one seemed to notice. A waiter, as a mere formality, asked, "Who done it, Owney?" To which Owney replied, "I done it myself." Moments later, Frida rushed back up the stairs demanding, "Who done it, Owney?" To which he retorted, "How do I know?" Within minutes, a contingent of police officers from the West 47th Street precinct pushed through the crowd and reached the balcony dot. They took one look at Owney's abdominal wounds and hurried back to call for an ambulance. Detectives knelt beside him, firing off questions, but the steadfast victim adhered to the street code, refusing to cooperate. "Nothing doing," he told them, bleeding profusely. "It's nobody's business but mine." By the time the ambulance arrived, his condition had deteriorated significantly and he showed little sign of life. At one point during the ride to Flower Hospital on 5th Avenue, the accompanying doctor deemed him near death and ordered the driver to divert to the morgue. However, Owney rallied slightly, prompting them to head directly to the hospital. As he was wheeled into the operating room, he exchanged a few curt words with the surgeon. "Get busy with the knife, doc. I can feel it got me bad." The medical team extracted 6 bullets from him, but 5 others remained lodged too deeply to remove. The surgeon concluded his efforts, stitching up the wounds and leaving the remaining bullets inside. After the operation, Owney regained consciousness and made an astonishing recovery. His resilience surprised the medical staff, who had almost given up hope. Within days, he was sitting up and receiving visitors, engaging in hushed conversations with his trusted lieutenants at his bedside. Within a week, 6 of the 11 dusters who had attempted to kill him were murdered, sending a clear message throughout Hell's Kitchen that Owney still held the reins despite his lengthy recovery. However, one man was reluctant to accept the news. Patsy Doyle, a psychotic killer known for his violent tendencies from the early days of the Gophers. Little Patsy, as he was known, resurfaced in the old haunts, a burly figure with a gold tooth, spreading rumours that Owney's injuries had left him permanently incapacitated. Doyle claimed that Madden was finished, signalling his bid for leadership. His troubles escalated with Patsy's ex-girlfriend, Frida Horner, Owney's current flame. He desperately wanted Frida back and thought that knocking him off in front of her at the arbor would win her back. Instead, she never left Owney's bedside, which hurt little Patsy. In the weeks that followed, the Dusters' ranks continued to deplete. Bodies were turning up on a daily basis as the Gophers launched an all-out attack on Owney's commands. Eventually, all that was left was little Patsy Doyle, who managed to gather a small group of impressionable gang members. Reports of his activities reached the hospital, and just days after Owney's release, Doyle was discovered unconscious in an alley, a lead pipe wrapped in newspaper lying nearby, the Duke's signature weapon. 3 weeks and a day after the Arbor shooting, Owney returned to the streets, which were fully aware of his presence. For most wise men, this would have marked the end of the conflict. Yet, consumed by jealousy, Doyle retaliated by attacking several of Owney's close associates. When Tony Romanello, one of Owney's most loyal deputies, taunted Doyle about Frida Horner, Doyle lost control. Shortly thereafter, Romanello was found brutally clubbed, stabbed and shot. By this time, Owney had broken with tradition, opening the Gophers to non-Irish members, indicating a shift in the gang's dynamics. Romanello was Italian, but Owney Madden never placed much importance on national or racial differences. Throughout his life, he provided protection to a select few Irish families in New York and Chicago. Eventually, he became one of the rare non-Italians privy to the mafia's deepest secrets, to the extent that they sought his counsel on sensitive matters regarding appointments and succession. The Doyle-Madden feud simmered for months, and the entire West Side awaited the inevitable confrontation. Most were betting on Madden, but he was in no rush. Like many gangsters, he possessed a deep reservoir of patience when it came to settling old scores. Owney's Arbor Hall gunshot wounds were a constant source of discomfort, necessitating multiple trips to the hospital for treatment. Friends began to notice that his typically easygoing demeanour was increasingly marred by a frown. Little Patsy Doyle continued to stir trouble in the neighbourhood, crossing the unthinkable line, by gang standards, of informing the aforementioned police about Owney's activities. Rumours circulated among the Gophers and local residents that Doyle was a snitch, yet Doyle's resolve to avenge his loss of Frida only intensified. Then, on October 23, 1914, Owney was arrested and charged with burglary, and many suspected Doyle's hand behind it. The case documents preserved in the New York District Attorney's records from 1914 accused him of pigeon rustling, an odd charge given that the devoted pigeon fanciers of Hell's Kitchen could recognise their own birds nearly blindfolded. Owney, listing his occupation as a driver, pleaded not guilty and demanded a full investigation into the circumstances of his arrest. The incident began when a poultry dealer locked his two-storey shop on Hewitt Avenue for the evening. The next morning, he discovered the lock broken and 200 pigeons, valued at $1,000, missing. Suspecting they knew the culprit, police visited Owney's apartment, where they found 75 pigeons on the roof, including 23 of the stolen birds. A detective promptly arrested Owney, the neighbourhood's most renowned pigeon fancier, and asked why the stolen birds were in his coops. The visit appeared to catch the Duke off guard. According to court files, defendant Madden has no idea about the stolen pigeons or how they got into his coops above his apartment. It's likely that Owney was being honest. He posted a bail of $1,000, persuaded the magistrate of his innocence, and was ultimately acquitted. It was later discovered that Patsy Doyle had stolen the pigeons and daringly placed them into Owney's coop, attempting to put the Gophers' leader behind bars. There was a mounting sense that something needed to be done about Doyle. On the night of November the 28th, 1914, as the first snow of winter lightly blanketed New York, steps were taken to silence him for good. Doyle had recently been arrested for the brutal assault on Tony Romanello, but Tony refused to cooperate with the detectives or press charges. Little Patsy emerged from custody with a smile, oblivious to the fact that his days were now numbered. Patsy Doyle received a phone call late one evening from Margaret Everdeen, a close friend of Frieda Horner. Margaret informed Doyle that Frieda wanted to reconcile for leaving him and rekindling her affair with Owney. "The poor kid's all busted up over the way she treated you, Patsy," Margaret said. "She wants to see you, and you can talk to her." Margaret waited for Doyle in the back of Nash's Cafe, a saloon located on the corner of 41st Street and 8th Avenue. Little Patsy reportedly received a tip that he was to be killed if he went there. However, his obsession with Frieda and the possibility of winning her back overshadowed any concerns for his safety. Upon entering the saloon, which would later become the New York City bus terminal, Doyle found the place eerily empty, except for the bartender, who was cleaning glasses, and Margaret sitting at a distant table. He seemed not to notice the unusual quietness for a Saturday night. "Where's Frieda?" he inquired. "She's gone out for a minute," Margaret replied. "She'll be right back. Sit down, Patsy." Just as he was about to pull out a chair, the bartender called out, "Hey, Patsy, there's someone here who wants to have words with you." "Who?" Doyle asked, turning toward the bar. "Me," came a voice from behind him. In an instant, he found himself face to face with two armed men. One thrust a revolver against his chest and fired. A barrage of shots erupted. Patsy staggered backward and collapsed to the floor. Gasping for breath, he struggled to pull the gun from his overcoat pocket. The grip emerged, but he lacked the strength to draw it fully. Bleeding from the chest, he stumbled down the length of the bar and out through the swinging doors into the snow-covered street. A patrolman heard the gunfire and discovered Doyle's body lying nearby on a tenement doorstep. The officer counted 6 bullet holes in his clothing. Johnny Hoppo McArdle, the Gophers' top hitman, was arrested for the shooting. Called Hoppo as he had one leg shorter than the other, he was Owney's right-hand man and dispatched 3 bullets into Patsy along with Owney's 3. 2 days later, detectives also apprehended Owney, charging him with murder. It took the district attorney nearly 6 months to prepare the case against him and bring it to trial. While Owney awaited his fate in the Tombs, New York's oldest and dampest prison, McArdle was sentenced to 13 years. The Tombs, located between Mulberry and Lafayette, where Foley Square now stands, was originally built on swampy ground. Officially known as the Hall of Justice, it earned the nickname Tombs due to its grim conditions. Conditions within the prison were notoriously harsh, but Owney, thanks to the intervention of Jimmy Hines, was given a comfortable cell and enjoyed meals delivered from a nearby restaurant. He had a double cell all to himself and room service that would rival any Fifth Avenue hotel. When Madden's trial began in May, the week-long proceedings were anything but comfortable. He knew he could count on McArdle's testimonies, but Frieda Horner and Margaret Everdeen drastically altered their accounts, accusing him of complicity. During the earlier Hoppo McArdle trial, Frieda and Margaret had gone to great lengths to protect Owney, swearing under oath that he had no knowledge of the murder. Now, however, their stories shifted dramatically, seemingly aimed at implicating him. "I used to go around with Patsy Doyle until 3 days before he was shot," Frieda testified, conveniently forgetting her lengthy affair with Owney. "At that time, I met Madden at a racket in Tammany Hall. I was with Madden for 2 nights afterward. On the night Doyle was killed, I was at a 10th Avenue lunchroom with the Madden crowd. I told them Doyle had said they were a bunch of bums." Frieda further claimed that Owney was standing outside the saloon at the time of the shooting, watching everything unfold. Margaret Everdeen recounted her version of the events, stating that Owney had persuaded her to meet Doyle in the saloon. "I told him, no, I don't want to make any trouble," she testified, but eventually went anyway. She added that she had left the saloon before the shots rang out, passing Hoppo and Madden as they entered. "Back at the lunchroom, I was crying, and Owney asked me what was the matter. 'You not only did a lot of shooting, you killed him,' I told him. 'What are you going to do?' he asked. 'Anything you want me to,' I replied. "Stop crying then," he said. "If you don't, people will get wise." Hoppo McCardle was transported from Sing Sing, where he was serving his sentence, to testify on Owney's behalf. His account remained consistent with their original testimonies during his own trial. Hoppo attempted to exonerate Owney, asserting he had killed Doyle in self-defense after 2 shots were fired at him. He explained the presence of 2 different types of bullets in Doyle's body by claiming he carried 2 revolvers. Regarding Owney, he stated they were not even on speaking terms at the time due to a dispute over pigeons, and he was never there. The jury faced significant challenges in untangling the complexities of Owney's alibis. Witnesses testified that Owney Madden was not present at the saloon during the shooting. Instead, he was at the hospital receiving treatment for gunshot wounds to his stomach. Afterward, he visited a barber shop located just 2 doors from the lunchroom, where he spent about an hour and 20 minutes getting his hair cut. Clearly, someone was not telling the truth. Owney took the stand and faced a 3-hour cross-examination with remarkable composure, though he became noticeably frustrated as the assistant district attorney pressed him on the testimonies of Frida and Margaret. Sensing his discomfort, the prosecutor began to extensively reference the women's evidence. After enduring what he deemed an unfair treatment, he lost his temper and shouted at the judge, "For what I'm getting here, I might as well plead guilty. Give me a show. I'm innocent. You might as well take me out and kill me and have it over with. I won't testify anymore." He was then escorted away in handcuffs to cool off in the Tombs for the remainder of the morning. When he returned after lunch, the jury had retired. After 7 hours of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict for the lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter instead of murder. Owney appeared relieved and requested the judge to pass sentence immediately. Word of his outburst in the courtroom had spread throughout Hell's Kitchen, drawing a crowd of gophers and local residents eager to witness the proceedings. Judge Charles Knott asked if the defendant had any final words before sentencing. Owney shook his head. Knott continued, "The sentence of the court is that he be committed to state prison for a minimum of 10 years and a maximum of 20. No sooner had Owney been taken downstairs and the crowds dispersed than a defence fund was initiated throughout Hell's Kitchen to finance an appeal. Some people contributed generously, while those who hesitated eventually opened their wallets when the gophers shook the collection tin a little more vigorously, and with Owney out the picture, the police stepped up their pursuit to disband the gang once and for all. The war against the gophers was nearing its end. Just a month after Owney's sentencing, 16 prominent members of the gang had been apprehended and convicted of various crimes. It marked the conclusion of an era. The fervour of youth would never again burn as brightly across the west side. Owney set aside the memories of the past and resigned himself to life in Sing Sing prison up the Hudson River. Owney barely completed a year of his sentence before the Winona Club was abandoned and the remaining gophers scattered. Sing Sing was designed to shock inmates. Its bleak remote structure made of grey stone offered little chance of escape. After 2 weeks in the reception block, Owney was classified as a C-class prisoner, a long-term inmate who was generally well behaved. Warden Laws was intrigued by the young leader of the gophers, who was only in his mid-20s but enjoyed a celebrity status among the 2,500 inmates. Owney was assigned tasks such as cleaning the yard and tending to the gardens, and he conducted himself as a model prisoner. On visiting days, his mother, sister and brother came regularly, along with familiar faces from Tammany Hall. As the years and his sentence dragged on, only a small group of dedicated friends and relatives made the arduous rail trip up the Hudson River to visit him. Among Owney's loyal visitors was George Raft, who would often sit in the vast visiting hall with a gift of Lucky Strike cigarettes, chatting animatedly. His visits always boosted Owney's spirits and provided a vital connection to the outside world, where significant changes were unfolding. George eagerly discussed the film industry, sharing his excitement about stars like Rudy Valentino and Douglas Fairbanks. While Owney was imprisoned, George was busy performing in the clubs and illegal gambling dens that were proliferating across New York City. He was well acquainted with many of the gangsters who operated these establishments, navigating a glamorous yet perilous underworld where fortunes could be made or lost at any moment, and the threat of arrest loomed large. Arnold Rothstein, a shadowy figure who would later become the secret financier for one of the country's largest criminal organizations, controlled many of the high-stakes games. The roster of gangsters who frequented Rothstein's crap games included future legends of American crime: Al Capone, then just a bouncer from Brooklyn; Waxy Gordon, a notorious hood from the Lower East Side; Lucky Luciano, the future crime lord of New York; and Larry Fay, a local mobster who enjoyed a flutter at the tables. Many nights, police headquarters would tip off the gamblers about impending raids, prompting the big shots to slip out through back exits, while lesser players were left behind to take the fall, lending the raids an air of authenticity. On one occasion, George found himself caught in a raid and, along with others, was taken to the police station. He cleverly avoided using his own name, was neither fingerprinted nor booked, and the charges against him were ultimately dismissed. Owney listened to such stories with rapt delight, gradually realising that the old ways had been supplanted by organised rackets involving vast sums of money. After George's visits, his restless mind must have brimmed with schemes and aspirations. In Sing Sing, however, he could only bide his time and dream patiently. The only way to cope with the frustration of being sidelined from the action was to serve his sentence diligently and hope for an early release. On February the 1st, 1923, Owney finally walked out of the prison gates a free man. Having earned his release for good behaviour, he had served only 7.5 years of his sentence, but was released under the shadow of parole. He knew that even the slightest infraction could send him back to complete the remainder of his term. This sobering awareness, combined with Warden Laws's guidance and years of self-reflection, profoundly altered his perspective on crime. He became wary of the swaggering toughs from Chicago, Philadelphia and Boston, seeing no need for violence when there was enough wealth to go around. Legs Diamond had advanced through the New York underworld and caught the headlines as a volatile figure driven by a thirst for bloodshed. This led to Owney further wanting to steer clear of him. Madden realised that such brutality was unnecessary when a smile and a firm command on the telephone would suffice. Of all the New York underbosses, perhaps only Owney and his future partner, Frank Costello, wielded power without perpetually looking down the barrel of a gun. Unlike many prominent mobsters, Owney was a sensitive man, and the precarious nature of his lifestyle took a toll on his nerves. As his wealth and influence grew, his private life became increasingly monastic and fraught with stress. In the 1920s, those who knew Owney Madden understood that his nervousness was not a sign of weakness. Despite his anxieties about being framed, killed or betrayed, he stood his ground against minor racketeers who underestimated him. Even with his mild demeanour and soft-spoken English politeness, he retained his reputation as the killer, making it clear that no one could afford to misjudge him. The first few weeks of Owney's freedom in 1923 brought a chaos he wasn't accustomed to in Sing Sing when he was released from prison. Prohibition had been in effect for 3 years, and a significant upheaval was occurring among the makeshift army of criminals supplying alcohol to thirsty New Yorkers. The Volstead Act had enacted prohibition on January 16, 1920, and banned alcohol nationwide. The 122 million Americans consuming more than 2 billion gallons of alcoholic beverages annually showed little desire for sobriety. Despite legal changes, drinking was not universally seen as a crime. Many considered enjoying a glass of bootleg alcohol absolutely fine. Bishop James Cannon Jr. of Virginia condemned New York as Satan's seat when it was revealed that the city's 15,000 pre-Prohibition bars had been replaced by 32,000 speakeasies, secret venues where alcohol was sold. The lofty ideals behind Prohibition aimed to reduce drunkenness and enhance productivity, but the outcome was a national obsession with alcohol and a booming bootleg industry. During Owney's imprisonment, supplies of liquor had been erratic and unreliable as small-time crooks scrambled to cash in during the initial years of Prohibition. Legal sources, such as medicinal whiskey and sacramental wine, provided a crucial supply. Alcohol that had been stockpiled before the Volstead Act's enforcement could also be released for medicinal purposes with the right authorization. The underground trade thrived. Despite the tumultuous atmosphere, influential crime figures were starting to take an interest. As Owney re-entered the streets of New York, he found an environment rapidly transitioning from disorganized chaos to more structured criminal enterprises. Small operators were quickly edged out, and bootlegging evolved from a cottage industry into a corporate venture. Owney returned to New York clutching a bundle of personal belongings and moved in with his mother on 10th Avenue, reconnecting with old friends and catching up on current events. Now 32, Owney had become a living legend among those who remembered the old gophers. Though he lacked financial resources and clout, he still commanded a measure of respect in the underworld and among political power players. Time had passed during his long prison sentence, but the changes he encountered aligned with his fresh outlook, a world where money could be made from activities that few considered criminal. This environment felt almost legitimate, providing a venue for him to leverage his skills and experiences for financial gain. Prohibition had unfolded like a comedic opera between 1920 and 1923, characterized by a surge in homemade brew sales and a frenzied approach to drinking fueled by the fear that any glass might be their last. The Prohibition Bureau in Washington went so far as to declare hip flasks illegal, stating that anyone caught with one risked confiscation of their trousers as a vehicle of transportation. The widespread disregard for the law reached such extremes that Henry Ford, the automobile magnate, threatened to dismiss any workers found hiding alcohol in their homes. Family members who previously drank in moderation began fermenting potatoes, yeast and sugar in their bathtubs, where hygiene was sacrificed for an insatiable thirst for alcohol. In the first year of Prohibition, authorities raided 32,000 illicit stills. By the fifth year, that number had skyrocketed to 172,000. To navigate the law, some shops capitalized on the demand by selling wine bricks for $2 each. These bricks would come with a precise set of instructions. Each brick dissolved in a gallon of water produces a gallon of unfermented, non-alcoholic punch juice. To prevent fermentation, add 1 to 10% benzoate of soda. Of course, the soda was never added. Industrial alcohol was watered down by other bootleggers and sold. However, as a result of drinking this alcohol not meant for human consumption, people were turning blind and some even died from it. The entrepreneurial spirit of New York gangsters stepped in to bring some regulation to the madness. Within a year of Owney's release, organized systems for alcohol distribution began to take shape. Thirsty New Yorkers could once again visit speakeasies akin to their old neighborhood bars or simply make a phone call for delivery. The development of this efficient distribution network came with its share of challenges. All organized crime in America during Prohibition could be traced back to two sources, the Anti-Saloon League and Henry Ford. The former created the market while the latter provided the means of transportation. Once this system was up and running, it was merely a matter of reinvesting profits into other ventures. Larry Fay, a New York taxi owner, was among the first to discover the lucrative potential of smuggling liquor. In the spring of 1920, he was a self-employed cab driver earning $25 a week when he was approached by a customer who wanted a ride over the border to Montreal. Hesitant at first, he ultimately agreed and found that he could purchase whiskey in Canada for only $10 a case. To offset his expenses, he bought 2 cases, concealed them in his trunk, and returned to New York, where he sold them for $100 each. Encouraged by this profit, he began making regular trips north, purchasing and reselling liquor on his return. Before long, he had amassed enough wealth to acquire a fleet of cabs and a truck. Fay operated with caution, varying his routes and timings, content to keep his purchases modest to minimize potential losses if he was caught. His system functioned smoothly for nearly a year until he was stopped in Lawrence, Massachusetts, while transporting a shipment of scotch from Trois-Rivières, Canada. He managed to escape with just a fine, but the experience deterred him from pursuing a full-scale bootlegging operation. Larry Fay reinvested his profits into expanding his cab company, transforming it into one of the largest in New York. He then turned his attention to nightclubs, capitalizing on the booming speakeasy scene. New York was a hub of independent cab operators and sizable fleets, all vying for business near popular speakeasies and busy train stations. His cabs stood out, adorned with polished alloy trims, small customized windows for privacy, strings of lights along the roofs and sides, and topped with chromium-plated musical horns that played catchy tunes. Fay prided himself on their class. His drivers were tough and chosen for their ability to fend off competition, supported by a crew of enforcers who ensured that no one dared intrude on his territory. As Mr. Cabs, Fay took great pride in how his business reflected his personality. During this time, Owney Madden began working for Fay, tasked with protecting 2 crucial taxi stands, the Grand Central and Pennsylvania stations. These were the most lucrative locations in New York, constantly under threat from rival cab companies. Owney orchestrated security like a general defending a besieged city, dispatching enforcers to handle trouble or bolster stands during peak hours. While he earned well for his efforts, the arrangement was short-lived. By the end of the year, Fay sold his company to a larger operator for a hefty sum. Fay, however, was restless and yearned for stardom. His glamorous cabs represented his aspirations, but they failed to fulfill him. He believed his true calling lay in nightclubs, which promised quick returns as venues for the flood of alcohol streaming into New York. He lavished the same care on the decor of his clubs as he had on his taxis. His first nightclub venture, the El Fay, named after himself, was opulently decorated. Owney, valuing loyalty, supported Fay's nightlife ventures as a way of repaying him for past help. Fay, however, had also played a pivotal role in Owney's affairs, encouraging a crucial reconciliation between Owney and George Jean Big Frenchie Demange, a formidable figure from the old Hudson Dusters. Larry recognised a mutual respect between Owney and Frenchie, despite their stark differences. The pair resembled a comedic duo like Laurel and Hardy. Owney, small and nervous, Frenchie, towering and robust. Fay was pleased to witness their reconciliation, believing it held untapped potential. Soon after, Owney and Frenchie became inseparable partners, forming one of the most enduring business relationships in New York's criminal history. Demange admired Owney's blend of toughness and genteel demeanour, appreciating his sharp intellect, which complemented his own brawn. Frenchie was big and awkward, with the clumsy charm of a heavyweight boxer, yet he had a knack for poker that could outplay New York's best. He was trustworthy and straightforward, qualities that resonated with Owney, solidifying their partnership. Owney's foray into bootlegging began when he and Big Frenchie broke into a warehouse, loading up a truck with barrels of bonded whiskey. Rather than sell it outright for a quick profit, Owney chose to bottle the whiskey, complete with printed labels, after sourcing suitable containers. They then cruised Manhattan, selling to speakeasies. The profits were so spectacular that Madden decided to devote all his energies to bootlegging. Bottling whiskey proved more efficient, leading Owney to target his first major heist, the imposing Liberty Storage Warehouse on West 64th Street. They broke into the warehouse, tied up the security guard and loaded up 200 cases of rye whiskey valued at $16,000, into the back of a truck. 4 detectives were immediately assigned to the case and began canvassing the neighbourhood. Residents reported seeing a truck closely followed by a Cadillac sedan that had broken down near the Liberty warehouse. Shortly after, another truck appeared and towed it away. Suspecting the first truck had been abandoned, the detectives launched a street-by-street search of the area early the next morning. They found the truck on West 44th Street, stripped of its contents, and decided to keep it under surveillance. About 2 hours later, a Cadillac sedan pulled up and 3 men got out, attempting to start the engine. The detectives quickly surrounded them with their guns drawn, and the trio surrendered without resistance. Back at the precinct, they identified themselves as Harry Jacobs, a known mobster, George DeMange, who had an arrest record for homicide, safe-cracking and burglary, but no convictions, and Owney Madden. All 3 were charged with assault and robbery and released on $10,000 bail each. Strangely, just days later, detectives informed the district attorney that they lacked sufficient evidence to proceed, and the case never went to court. It's believed Owney leaned on Jimmy Hines to brush this one under the carpet. Owney was busy day and night building a bootlegging empire with a determination reminiscent of his earlier days. Interestingly, those who remembered him, regardless of their legal affiliations, did not perceive him as having a criminal mentality. Instead, they viewed him as a tough businessman, generous to those less fortunate. His leadership skills and financial savviness were undeniable. While Owney was arguably a product of a corrupt system, he openly enjoyed the gangland lifestyle. Though he might have thrived in legitimate business, he would have felt stifled without the thrill of living on the edge. He was a keen judge of character and gravitated toward the bold, larger-than-life figures of the underworld who operated on a knife's edge, dismissing the risks of death or imprisonment. Owney felt a kinship with them. After his time in Sing Sing, he avoided violence in most of his criminal activities, but he still carried a gun when travelling for protection. A month after the Liberty warehouse raid, in early January 1924, state troopers flagged down a truck on the outskirts of Bedford Village, Westchester County, for a routine inspection. Using their flashlights, they discovered 6 men cramped inside the cab. Upon investigation, the truck was found to be loaded with $25,000 worth of pre-World War I whiskey. At the Westchester police station, the leader of the group identified himself as James Malloy, but a fingerprint check revealed him to be Owney Madden. The other gang members were released on a $15,000 bail each, while Owney faced a charge for possessing a firearm. Mysteriously, the police again failed to build a case, and none of the 6 men were ever brought to trial. Law enforcement was notoriously lenient in bootlegging cases, often corrupt. Once again, Jimmy Hines intervened, leading to the charges being dropped against Owney. However, this time, Hines told Owney that he needed to be more careful before people started to suspect the Tammany Hall leader was involved. Owney was perhaps more connected to Jimmy Hines than anyone else in the New York underworld, but their influence had its limits. Owney was acutely aware that under the terms of his parole, mingling with known criminals could lead to his return to prison to serve the remainder of his 10 to 20-year sentence. Owney heeded the warning, becoming more cautious in his dealings and avoiding direct involvement unless a job was significant enough to demand his personal oversight. Yet, stepping back entirely was not an option. The 1920s were turbulent years, and leading often meant demonstrating strength by example. During this time, Big Frenchie, who had substantial interests in nightclubs, recognised Owney's expanding influence and invited him into a partnership. One evening in the early 1920s, a limousine stopped in front of Harlem's Club Deluxe, and a group of sharply dressed men entered, requesting to see the owner. Jack Johnson, the former world heavyweight boxing champion, was a beloved figure in the African-American community and was well acquainted with Owney, who had a deep appreciation for boxing. After retiring, Johnson had transformed a dilapidated building at the corner of Lenox and 142nd Street into a supper club. The two-storey venue had once housed a theatre downstairs and a dance hall above, but patrons had long abandoned it for the trendier Renaissance casino on West 133rd Street. During the early years of Prohibition, Johnson's club struggled to thrive. Success in this business required solid liquor connections, and while Jack knew Owney, he had no interest in the criminal underworld. Owney, on the other hand, was deeply entrenched in it. Johnson welcomed Owney's offer to buy out the Deluxe, especially since the deal included his continued role in management. Big Frenchie became an operating partner, and Arnold, the banker Rothstein, who had investments in numerous bootlegging enterprises, also took a stake in the club. Harlem had once been a fashionable neighbourhood where both black and white professionals retired to their grand homes, many of which were designed by renowned architects. However, by 1900, housing prices began to plummet due to an influx of migrant workers from the South. Many homes were converted into rental properties, leading to overcrowding and prompting wealthy families to leave. Despite the poverty and violence present during the day, Harlem thrived at night, becoming a vibrant hub for jazz dancing and a flourishing artistic community known as the Harlem Renaissance. In the early years of the 1920s, the atmosphere was charged with creative energy and optimism. Young musicians like Duke Ellington arrived in New York looking for work. Although he initially found the opportunities disappointing, the electric atmosphere of the Renaissance drew him in. Singers like Ethel Waters and Florence Mills captivated audiences in dimly lit clubs as the post World War I dance craze lingered, bringing musicians from across the country to Harlem, where any musical style was embraced, allowing for endless experimentation and improvisation. The residents of Harlem took pride in their neighbourhood, which had blossomed into a centre for African American culture. White patrons often ventured uptown to soak in the lively atmosphere, a presence that was not always welcomed. Tensions sometimes boiled over, leading to police intervention in knife fights and brawls instigated by intruding outsiders in the nightclubs. Owney, well connected in the uptown entertainment scene through his Irish ties, had long been aware of the nightlife in Harlem. Owney's keen interest in street talk, underworld gossip, and newspaper columns allowed him to stay well informed about the happenings in Harlem. He sensed that the neighbourhood was primed for development. Harlem at that time boasted a unique atmosphere and vibrant energy that wealthy white society would be eager to experience. Those already enchanted by the thrill of mingling with gangsters in downtown speakeasies would surely be drawn to the added allure of live jazz and endless dancing. Determined to breathe new life into the old Deluxe, Owney knew it needed a name that reflected its fresh offerings. The Cotton Club, with its carefree southern vibe, seemed like the perfect choice. While no one knows for sure who came up with the name, Owney, known for his meticulous attention to detail, was likely a key player in its creation. Along the way, Owney had gleaned insights from observing Larry Fay, who meticulously tended to his establishments. Although Owney didn't fully endorse Fay's over-the-top approach, he understood that no detail could be overlooked. Frenchie, who owned the Club Argonaut and had stakes in several other clubs, collaborated with Owney as they refined their vision. They enlisted Joseph Urban, a fashionable interior designer, to surround the stage with jungle-themed decor. Auditions were held to find exceptional dancers and singers as the talent needed to impress the clientele Owney aimed to attract, many of whom would likely come to the Cotton Club after enjoying Broadway's finest shows. Out of courtesy, Owney first consulted with his associates, Big Bill Dwyer and Frank Costello, to share his plans, just as they would have done for him. Although Owney initially broke into the bootlegging scene by hijacking Big Bill Dwyer's trucks, the two soon joined forces, importing whiskey from Britain and rum from the West Indies. Frank Costello handled negotiations and was brought into the Madden-Dwyer partnership as an equal. Two whiskey brands soon flooded New York, House of Lords and King's Ransom, imported from J.C. Turney and Sons of Leaf, Scotland. Costello's Prohibition purchases were so large that the distiller rewarded him with an annual $5,000 salary and the title of United States Sales Consultant, whose main duty was to check if New York vendors stocked these brands. King's Ransom, a high-end 12-year-old Scotch, fit the bootlegger's style perfectly. The whiskey's Scottish creator, William Whiteley, was just as bold. He had travelled to London in the 1920s to secure permission for the name House of Lords and allegedly bribed an official for a letter of authority. Though Whiteley ignored repeated demands to stop using the name, he sold it in nearly 100 countries, excluding the UK, where it was banned. Whiteley often treated his foreign distributors to Thames River boat rides where, by sheer coincidence, a barge labelled House of Lords would pass by Westminster. During Prohibition, New Yorkers dubbed King's Ransom the round-the-world Scotch because of Whiteley's unusual aging method. He offered shipping companies free casks to use as ballast, allowing the whiskey to mature during lengthy ocean voyages. This innovative tactic saved Whiteley on storage costs and added to the brand's mystique. The next step of Owney's Operation Nightclub involved initiating discussions with Tammany Hall, which coordinated police protection. Politicians often enjoyed the privilege of sending friends, relatives or constituents who were seeking jobs as doormen or waiters. Owney aimed to keep as much of his business within the family as possible. Other City Hall departments also had to be considered. Health department inspectors had to be catered to ensure the nightclub's kitchen met cleanliness standards. Likewise, inspectors from the buildings department were responsible for verifying the structural safety of the venue, while fire department inspectors checked for fire hazards. These inspectors were all part of a network requiring a bribe. In other clubs, these expenses were often offset by raising drink prices. For instance, whiskey could spike from a standard 15 cents a shot to nearly 75 cents to cover protection costs. However, as a major bootlegger, Owney was in a position to keep his prices low while still attracting a steady stream of customers. The extensive corruption linked to Tammany Hall meant that every piece of club equipment had to be scrutinised for political connections before purchases were made. For example, light bulbs could only be sourced from the Monroe Lamp and Equipment Company on West 14th Street, as two Democratic district leaders had interests in the firm. Fire extinguishers had to come from the Croker National Fire Prevention Company, run by the nephew of a Tammany Hall boss. Owney's laundry business handled the supply of clean linens, but other necessities like paint, carpet, drapes and stage lighting had to be procured through the appropriate racketeers or political channels. Other clubs had to approach Owney for their linen services, drink supplies and even permission to open competing establishments. Violating these unspoken rules could have serious consequences. One such misstep occurred when a chic club called The Plantation opened further down Lenox Avenue at West 126th Street without the necessary consultations. At that time, Duke Ellington's orchestra was temporarily released from its contract in Hollywood, and Cab Calloway and his band filled in at the Cotton Club until their return. Calloway, known for his eccentric and exuberant performances, was a significant draw. When Ellington resumed his engagement at the Cotton Club, the Plantation quickly booked Calloway as a rival attraction. Owney tolerated the new owners' audacity in opening their club without his blessing, as well as their choice of another southern name. However, poaching stars was deemed a serious breach of etiquette. A few days later, Owney and a few of his boys paid a visit to the Plantation, destroying every piece of furniture and smashing all the bottles and glassware. Their final act of vandalism was to tear out the club's showpiece bar, a grand and elaborate structure, and dump it in the gutter. Unsurprisingly, no one stepped forward to identify the culprits, and no charges were ever filed. Meanwhile, Cab Calloway happily accepted an offer to return to the Cotton Club. Duke Ellington's genius became a major attraction, and Owney promoted him extensively. The new Cotton Club floor show, featuring fresh Ellington compositions, turned into a major New York attraction. Weekly radio broadcasts from the Cotton Club propelled Ellington's career to new heights. While most patrons were white, this was not due to any explicit policy of racial discrimination, but rather a combination of high prices and a management desire to avoid a reputation for trouble. Owney and Frenchie understood that violence was not inherently linked to race. Rather, they aimed to steer clear of the bloody confrontations that plagued other clubs in Harlem during the 1920s. As the Cotton Club established itself as a premier venue for high-class entertainment, mixed audiences became increasingly common. Duke Ellington himself played a crucial role in breaking down barriers when he remarked to Owney that many of his friends wanted to see his band perform. If one thing hallmarked Owney's clubs, it was an absence of fear. Anyone could visit the Cotton Club without the slightest worry of violence or intimidation. Everything from the show to the food and the quality of the service was of the highest standard. Big performers like Ellington and Calloway looked back fondly on their time at the Cotton Club. After shows, Ellington would linger until breakfast, playing cards with Big Frenchie, who came alive when a deck of cards was in his hands. Louis Sobel, a journalist, along with gossip columnist Walter Winchell, joined the card games while simultaneously gathering tidbits for their columns. Under Owney's influence, Frenchie mellowed significantly and refined his manners to fit the Cotton Club's exclusive image. Despite his efforts, he could hardly disguise his appearance. Big Frenchie was a hulking figure with a pockmarked face, a broken nose and piercing eyes set deep beneath thick black brows. Most nights he could be found with Owney at their favourite table at the back of the club, from where they could monitor the flow of business, enjoy the show and greet visitors. Once Owney established himself in the bootlegging business, he became a curious teetotaler, never drinking alcohol for the rest of his life. His lifestyle, while marked by a certain generosity, was simple to the point of frugality, and he carefully selected a small circle of friends. During the busy evenings at the Cotton Club, when the atmosphere grew loud and raucous, Owney would retreat to the roof for some fresh air, often listening to the cooing of the prize pigeons he kept in a loft he had constructed whilst looking out at the lights of Broadway. Broadway extended through Manhattan like a vibrant ribbon, a lively grid of streets and avenues brimming with jazz, cuisine and culture. The 1920s was a time when Manhattan revelled in the exuberance of the jazz age, and underworld figures enjoyed the celebrity that came from supplying New York with bootlegged liquor. In the bustling clubs and shows lining Broadway, it became fashionable for gangsters and glamorous showgirls to be seen in each other's company. The 1920s rolled on like an endless celebration, with little concern other than how to spend their profits. A favoured destination for spending money was a series of clubs along Broadway owned by the boisterous Texas Guinan and her silent partner, Owney Madden. After the success of the Cotton Club, Guinan had reached out to Owney for his help in improving a few of her clubs, to which he accepted and transformed them in style. As a result, Owney's network of nightclubs had grown into the largest and most prestigious in New York, yet despite securing political protection, there was still the risk of a judge enforcing a padlock order for selling illegal liquor. Closures had become so routine that they were almost tedious, but rarely disrupted the smooth operation of his empire. Clubs could avoid padlocking by posting a $1,000 bond against future violations, but many chose to gamble and continued their operations. Texas Guinan's clubs had faced so many closures that she wore a necklace of gold padlocks and sported a miniature gold police whistle as part of her charm bracelet. On one of her many trips to the local precinct, an admiring officer gifted Texas a police whistle, which she quickly adopted as her signature prop. Whenever business slowed and drinks weren't flowing, she would strut onto the dance floor and unleash a piercing blast from the whistle. "Come on, suckers," she would yell. "Open up and spend some jack." At her cue, the cheering crowd would happily reach for their wallets. Texas was undeniably the reigning queen of the nightclubs. As one newspaper put it, If Tammany Hall runs the city by day, Texas Guinan runs it by night. Texas and Owney shared a close friendship that translated into a highly effective business partnership. Texas had an irresistible urge to be in the spotlight, captivating patrons with her high-energy performances. Owney was content to stay in the background and manage the staff in his newfound string of clubs he part-owned, particularly paying interest in the performers and waitresses, being a ladies' man. The performers were selected for their striking beauty, yet they were strictly supervised. Interacting with customers was off limits, and any inebriated patron who attempted to pull a girl onto his lap risked being tossed out onto the sidewalk, after settling his tab, of course. Nights at Guinan's venues, like the 300, were loud and lively, frequented by many notable figures including Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, and Harry Richman. All singers and dancers who also put on floor shows for the patrons, which were the talk of the town. The creative force behind these floor shows was Nils T. Granlund, who had survived a kidnapping attempt by gangster Vincent Coll. Granlund favoured a fast-paced, punchy entertainment style that could cut through even the thickest fog of drunkenness. During this time, Owney took pleasure in supporting emerging entertainers, and frequently seized opportunities to assist his childhood friend, George Raft, ensuring he always had work at Guinan's clubs. George often followed the cherry dancers and performed alongside them. With regular employment, George Raft worked diligently, earning a tidy sum of $1,000 a week. After dazzling the crowd at the 300 Club, George would rush to the other clubs to play for Owney and Texas. During these frantic evenings, George relied on Owney's speedy Packard to navigate the city. In return for the vehicle's use, he collected box office receipts from Owney's investments in various Broadway shows. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. Owney valued George's trustworthiness, while Raft relished the vibrant atmosphere of Broadway theatres and their glamorous stars. George quickly became a recognisable face along the Broadway, and since he often handled Owney's business between performances, he earned a reputation as the best-dressed man in town. His signature style included a black shirt with a white tie and a grey fedora pulled low over one eye, all inspired by Owney. In April 1926, one of George Raft's regular stops on Broadway was Daly's Theatre, where he collected box office receipts from an audacious play titled Sex. The name Janet Mast was a pseudonym for its star, Mae West, with whom Owney had a long-standing relationship. George often visited Mae in her dressing room for friendly chats, and she took a shine to him. The two would later share the screen in the 1932 Hollywood film Night After Night, which Raft jokingly remarked, "She stole everything but the cameras." For the time being, though, George wasn't quite ready to embrace acting. Owney had known Mae long before her rise to Broadway fame. Among his numerous business ventures, he managed the Harding Hotel on 54th Street, right next to Texas Guinan's Club. The hotel housed a mix of colourful characters, including Legs Diamond and boxer Kid Berg. Mae's father, John West, known as Battling Jack, ran a private detective agency from the hotel and was a well-respected figure among both law enforcement and the criminal underworld. Owney had first met Mae at the hotel. Mae was captivated by Owney's understated English manners and held a deep pride in her lineage, which she traced back to Long Crendon in Buckinghamshire. She cherished a slim family history book, often reciting the preface to guests. The Wests were an ancient family of knightly rank, connected by ties of marriage and descent to royal lineages and other noble families throughout the kingdom. However, Owney's appeal to her was not that of a noble knight. Rather, he embodied the toughest man she had ever encountered. Though Mae had a fondness for muscle-bound men, Owney's unique style set him apart from the other gangsters she knew. When Owney was away on business, Mae would talk about him non-stop, affectionately calling him her clay pigeon because of the many times he had been shot. He must have taken 26 bullets, she rambled drunk late at night. Every few months he had to go to the hospital to have another one dug out. Whenever Mae took her shows on the road, Owney ensured she was well taken care of at every stop. Word of her arrival would be sent ahead to prepare a fitting reception. When she played in Chicago, Al Capone and his associates always showed up to greet her, decorating her dressing room with flowers. In Detroit, the Purple Gang did the same. They all knew she was Owney's girl. On the back of the success of Sex, Owney decided to invest in Diamond Lil. Diamond Lil was the first play Mae West wrote herself. Mae had poured herself into the show, crafting dialogue on scraps of paper and envisioning herself in the lead role of Margie Lamont, a Montreal hooker with a heart of gold entangled with a blackmailer. The play's provocative title was meant to draw in crowds, and after the first performance it was bringing in $14,000 a week. Mae changed the lines and scenes to make it even more provocative, and by the end of its 11-month run, Mae was ad-libbing more daring lines each night. Her improvised quips eventually caught the attention of City Hall, and police officers began to attend her shows. Ultimately, Mae was charged with obscenity when Mayor Joseph Holy Joe McKee initiated a case against her. Throughout her court appearances, Mae captivated reporters with her daily costume changes, donning stylish black satin dresses, fur-trimmed coats, and cloche hats or turbans. The trial concluded with Mae receiving a $500 fine and an 8-day sentence at Welfare Island Reformatory. Whilst Mae was getting arrested, Owney had grand ambitions to expand his bootlegging empire by pouring funds into sea-based smuggling and moving directly into liquor manufacturing and brewing. By the mid-1920s, he, along with his partners Big Bill Dwyer and Frank Costello, were dominating the booze trade along Rum Row, a notorious smuggling route that ran the length of the eastern seaboard from Florida to Maine. The US Coast Guard, struggling to keep up, plastered New York with recruitment ads, but recruiting was tough. Most of the adventurous types were already on payrolls working for Madden, Costello, or Dwyer. Their operations on the high seas became legendary. Risky but lucrative, these bootleggers needed only 1 in 5 shipments to make it to shore to break even. The smugglers operated high-speed vessels that outpaced the Coast Guard, including surplus Navy submarine chasers and torpedo boats stocked with booze. Unlike the trigger-happy street thugs of New York, Owney, Costello and Dwyer ran their operations with shrewd business acumen. Costello refined the rum-running operation into a highly efficient system. His freighters, manned by hardened men in trench coats and fedoras, braved rough waters. Hijackings on the open sea were common, and any attempt to board Costello's ships was often met with machine gun fire. Costello's strength lay in adapting his strategies quickly to outsmart Prohibition agents, and he reportedly had the Coast Guard on his payroll at every level. "Everyone gets his share," he'd say, as Coast Guard officials discreetly directed his vessels to safe landing spots, even helping unload cargo. When one of his ships hit an iceberg and sank with a valuable cargo, Costello famously quipped, "Too bad we can't buy the icebergs." Owney's partnership with Dwyer was free of formal records, as Big Bill was known to evade official paperwork. By the time the two joined forces, Dwyer already owed the government $800,000 in back taxes, and both he and Owney preferred keeping their dealings unrecorded. Their lawyer, Joe Shalek, estimated their daily costs in wages, bribes, shipping and storage at around $10,000, around $180,000 today. They commandeered vessels of all kinds to transport whiskey from freighters anchored at Rum Row. Some crew members occasionally failed to resist the temptation of their cargo, leading to mishaps. Once the entire crew of Owney's schooner, the Allegro, became drunk on high-end scotch and drifted directly into the path of a Coast Guard ship, losing a $120,000 cargo and landing in a Philadelphia jail. Unknown to most of the Coast Guard, the Madden-Dwyer shipments making their way down Rum Row didn't sail directly from Europe or the West Indies. Instead, they originated from St. Pierre, a tiny, wind-battered island in the North Atlantic, far beyond any territorial waters. Costello had struck a deal with St. Pierre's mayor to use the island as a staging ground, storing his imported liquor for a commission of $2 per case. By the time they'd moved 2 million cases, mostly King's Ransom, St. Pierre's residents had become wealthy on their remote island outpost, thriving under the unlikely boom that Prohibition had brought their way. Frank approached his work with relentless precision. Soon, the ships of Owney Madden and Bill Dwyer anchored alongside Frank's navy. As Costello and Dwyer handled bulk imports, Owney took charge on American soil. By 1925, he held sway over nearly every corner of the bootlegging world, controlling beer brewing and major nightclubs, even running a linen laundering business as cover for discreetly moving shipments of King's Ransom and House of Lords Scotch across New York in laundry baskets. What started as a clever front, however, soon proved Owney's biggest business blunder. After investing over $250,000 in 3 city-wide laundry chains, he realised the demanding nature of the business. Despite a turnover of $2 million, the returns were paltry next to bootlegging's sky-high margins. Frustrated, he confided, "I like investments where you double your money in a week or two, but these are legit businesses. You're waiting forever." His reflection captured the classic gangster's perspective on business. Even his closest confidants, like Bill Dwyer and Frenchie Demange, would have struggled to list all of Owney's ventures, from breweries and nightclubs to laundries and speakeasies. Clubs he had no stake in still sought his advice on decor and business tips, which he offered honestly, never gossiping or indulging in wild nights. Outside business, his time went to training homing pigeons in a select few social circles, notably including Texas guinan and Mae West. His imposing maroon bulletproof Duesenberg, gifted to him by Cuban President Fulgencio Batista, was often spotted outside their apartments. Though known for his toughness, he had a soft spot for kids, handing out sweets from a stash in his car's glove box to the kids who'd cheer Uncle Owney when he pulled up. Owney's presence became part of the Jazz Age's fabric, embodying the self-made millionaire persona, albeit through bootlegging. The audacity of his success only heightened his popularity, aligning him with a public defying the Prohibition laws. Unlike the brute figures around him, Owney carried himself with a style and swagger that would influence the gangster look Hollywood would later embrace. George Raft once admitted, "If you were on Broadway back then, you'd have to avoid clubs not to run into them." These guys like Owney and Larry Fay had a certain appeal. In their world, they were bigger stars than many performers. Raft's connection to Owney eventually involved him in bootlegging, including helping on nighttime booze runs through New York's deserted streets. George's primary role was to drive a Packard either ahead of or behind the trucks carrying Owney's liquor, each vehicle manned by shotgun-armed guards to keep watch for ambushes. Men often died in those deserted streets, but George seemed to thrive on the adrenaline. Owney preferred to move shipments in the early hours when neighbourhoods were empty and any rival activity could be spotted from afar. Just after finishing a nightclub gig, George would jump into the Packard, still dressed in his tuxedo and tap shoes, ready to face the risks of a booze run through the city's shadowy streets. Once they reached the edge of Owney's territory, the convoy would be met by reinforcements and distributed to speakeasies across the city. Meanwhile, the city's Prohibition Bureau struggled against the tide of corruption. Federal agents and local police took in about $59.8 million in bribes between 1923 and 1931. Beat patrolmen were paid $1 for each of the 4.8 million half barrels of beer delivered to speakeasies annually. Just one of Owney's clubs near Grand Central, paid $31,200 a year to operate without interference, most of it funneled into the political machine. Owney, despite making an estimated $3 million a year, never fully embraced a life of luxury or ease. He preferred to hustle his own sales, visiting speakeasies, and even selling cases directly from his car at the curb. His influence with the police and powerful figures like Jimmy Hines allowed him to be bold. Once he was spotted selling beer from the steps of the New York Public Library on 42nd Street with a black Cadillac filled with cases parked nearby, its windows tightly curtained. Owney enjoyed visiting speakeasies run by his rivals, especially Dutch Schultz, and making a scene. He'd order a beer, hold the glass up to the light and take a long swig, acting as if he hadn't tasted one in years. Then he'd grimace, spit it out on the floor, and demand, "Who sold you this dishwater?" When the bartender would stammer that it came from Schultz, Owney would shake his head with a smile. "From now on, you're buying from me." Schultz was infamous for peddling needle beer, a diluted, often greenish brew so awful that bar owners stocked it out of fear rather than choice. Owney's own beer, known as Madden's No. 1, became a symbol of quality. Produced by the Phoenix Cereal Beverage Company, the massive brewery Owney co-owned with Big Bill Dwyer, it churned out around 800,000 half barrels annually, generating an estimated $7.4 million in profits. The Phoenix was housed in a sprawling old brewery on 10th Avenue that had once belonged to Clausen and Flanagan. When Prohibition began, many brewers shifted to making cereal beverages like near beer, a weak concoction below 0.5% alcohol, but few Americans had any taste for it. New Yorkers who craved real beer embraced Owney's Phoenix Brewery. He believed that offering quality beer would set him apart from the foul-tasting substitutes being sold elsewhere, and his gamble paid off. The Phoenix became known for its fine beer with a creamy, almost British-style head. The brewery itself, towering above 10th Avenue, was a symbol of Madden's influence. While the government turned a blind eye, barrels rolled out onto delivery trucks bound for speakeasies across the city. Owney's popularity was growing. Though shy by nature and wary of attention, he was becoming a local hero, a saviour of sorts for thirsty New Yorkers, much to his discomfort. Clubs linked to Madden became popular hotspots for socialites, eager to brush shoulders with gangland figures. They were thrilled when Owney Madden was pointed out. Owney's charm and polished appearance only added to his appeal. To Westsiders, however, he was still just the Duke, and the police, pockets lined with Madden's payments, ensured federal agents couldn't touch him. One frustrated federal agent described how merely parking near the brewery would prompt a swarm of officers ordering them to move. Even driving nearby after midnight was like setting off an alarm, he complained. Whistles blew, doors slammed, sounded like a bird sanctuary. The Bureau spent years trying to bring Owney's partner, Big Bill Dwyer, to justice. Attorney Bruce Bielaski, a tough prosecutor, was paid a hefty monthly fee to take down rum runners, with Dwyer his prime target. Big Bill's flashy lifestyle and arrogant demeanour made him easy to spot and detest in court. He appeared to sneer, though this was partly due to a car accident that left his jaw misaligned, unintentionally twisting his mouth. Ultimately, Dwyer's attitude did little to help him. He was sentenced to prison, or college, as it was often called in the underworld. While Dwyer served time, Owney continued running the Phoenix with calm confidence. With the New York police on his side, there was little the agents could do to break through the brewery's defences. Prohibition director Morris Campbell may have understood the depth of Owney's influence better than anyone. In his early efforts to close the Phoenix, he received a visit from a prominent New York Republican politician offering $200,000 in cash to stop targeting the brewery. In the midst of the looming Great Depression, New Yorkers maintained a strong affection for their lively mayor Jimmy Walker and the discreet yet influential Owney Madden, who kept the booze flowing. Owney's charm and skill helped him navigate this world of lawless exuberance. He had successfully evaded legal traps, surviving where others had fallen. As the exuberant 1920s wound down, Owney had little idea that the forces of change and a new wave of law enforcement were closing in. For Owney, few things in the gangland scene matched the thrill of showgirls and actresses, except perhaps the intensity of the fight game. Madden had been a boxing enthusiast since he was young, and his circle included many professional fighters. He not only supported them financially, covering training and promotion expenses, but also held substantial investments in their careers. During the 1920s and 1930s, he managed interests in 5 world champions, including Max Baer and Rocky Marciano, who both became close friends. Madden's business partner, Big Frenchie, shared his enthusiasm for boxing and took particular pleasure in backing fighters set to face opponents sponsored by rival mobsters. He especially took pride in his involvement with Primo Carnera, a spectacle in the ring who, despite limited English, became an American favourite. Carnera's towering figure and raw strength made him a sensation, yet controversy surrounded his career, with many suggesting that several of his fights were fixed. Given Madden and Frenchie's involvement, some of these claims may have been true, though Carnera himself may have been oblivious. Though Carnera's time as a champion brought Madden substantial profits, many accounts suggest that Carnera saw little of his earnings due to the managers involved. Compared to the fighters Madden often supported without strings attached, Carnera was an awkward powerhouse, known more for his resilience than skill. Still, Carnera held his own against top fighters in grueling matches. He eventually lost his heavyweight title to Madden's friend Max Baer in an 11th round knockout, one of the most intense bouts in boxing history. Both fighters hit the canvas, leading to Baer's famous quip, "The last one up's a sissy." Oddly enough, every champion in whom Owney Madden held an interest seemed to land a part in Hollywood films. His connections were deep. Rumours suggested he had both contracts and financial stakes in certain studios. He used his considerable influence to benefit his friends whenever the opportunity arose. Among the most colourful and closest of his boxing pals was world light heavyweight champion Maxie Rosenblum, who later became a Hollywood fixture. Madden also invested in amateur boxing clubs on the West Side and funded boys' clubs, hoping to give young men a chance at a better life without resorting to crime. This wasn't just a business move, it was a genuine belief in helping others. He often warned young troublemakers to stay on the right side of the law, despite his own dark past. On one occasion, Madden even financed a transatlantic tournament, sending young boxers to Liverpool to face their counterparts there. By the late 1920s, Owney Madden had solidified his power, his influence rising over New York's gritty skyline like a monument to his success. His empire now spanned from the ritzy clubs of the Cotton Club and the Stork to the Silver Slipper, each a symbol of the era's glitz and decadence. His rum-running operations remained strong, with ships constantly making their way to Rum Row, loaded with his premium liquors, King's Ransom and House of Lords. The Phoenix Brewery operated at full capacity, fueling the demand for illicit alcohol. Beyond the bars, Owney expanded his reach into real estate, acquiring hotels, apartments and office buildings, as well as investing heavily in boxing and Broadway shows. By all measures, his story was the quintessential American success story, the Leeds-born man who had risen from Hell's Kitchen to a position of formidable wealth and power. Madden had cultivated ties to the most influential figures in New York, Democratic politicians, the NYPD, the US Coast Guard, the judiciary and, of course, the criminal underworld. Yet, as Owney knew too well, empires are fragile and a single misstep could send everything into chaos. His early lessons with Patsy Doyle had shown him how quickly an empire could be brought down by a rogue gunman. And now, just as his own empire seemed unshakable, another wild figure emerged in the underworld, Vincent Coll. Coll, like Doyle, was a hothead of Irish descent, with a temper that could ignite violence at the slightest provocation. He was unpredictable, and even the seasoned mob bosses like Owney Madden, Dutch Schultz, and Frank Costello were wary of him. Coll's rise through the ranks came on the heels of Prohibition, which had made millionaires out of New York's big-name gangsters, but there were always ambitious men lurking in the shadows, eager to usurp their power. Dutch Schultz, despite making thousands every day, was one such gangster. His reckless ambition only fueled men like Coll, who were driven to take over not just a block, but entire neighborhoods. As these power struggles intensified, Owney began to feel the pressure mounting. Though Madden continued to expand his operations, he could sense the storm brewing. The city on the surface may have appeared to be business as usual, but the gangsters were engaged in a quiet, deadly war of nerves. Dutch Schultz was particularly brazen, testing his rival's patience at every turn. A 1931 newspaper report would hint at the tensions between Madden and Schultz. In January, Schultz narrowly escaped an ambush by Madden's men. The two had been at odds for some time, with an unspoken agreement to stay on opposite sides of 54th Street, but at Christmas, Schultz crossed the line, literally and figuratively, when he and his crew barged into Madden's territory, the Club Abbey, and started shooting up the place. The result was chaos. Schultz was wounded, and the club's floor show was replaced with a hail of gunfire. While Schultz was testing the limits of his empire, the rest of the underworld was beginning to realise that unchecked violence was putting them all at risk. By 1929, many of the more level-headed crime bosses began pushing for a ceasefire, realising that the public's patience with gang violence was wearing thin. The killing of Arnold Rothstein, Owney's partner in the Cotton Club, marked a turning point. Rothstein, a compulsive gambler with ties to some of the nation's most high-profile criminal activities, had been found murdered in New York. The loss was significant for Owney. Rothstein had been instrumental in financing early bootlegging operations and other criminal enterprises. Rothstein's death, combined with rising public backlash against organised crime, sparked a realisation among gangland leaders that a more organised and less violent underworld might be the only way to survive. Meanwhile, the violence in Chicago escalated as Al Capone's infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre cast a dark shadow over the city. With the murder of 7 men, rival bootleggers, Capone had once again proven that he was willing to risk everything for control. In New York, a battle was also raging within the mafia, with Joe, the boss Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano both vying for control. This conflict would become a deadly standoff that saw Maranzano kidnap and severely injure Lucky Luciano, signalling his intent to go to any lengths to unseat Masseria. As tensions boiled over, the leaders of America's crime syndicates realised that a war among themselves would only weaken their collective power. It was time to end the internal feuds. Luciano, a close friend of Owney's, took it upon himself to approach Masseria with the idea of peace. When Luciano, still bruised from his kidnapping, presented the proposal, Masseria's suspicion was immediate. A tense conversation followed, and Masseria rejected the notion outright. The possibility of peace seemed to fade, but the underworld knew it needed unity if it was to survive. Frank Costello, a key player in Luciano's camp, suggested a more drastic approach: hold a meeting but without Masseria. Owney and Frenchie, two of the more neutral figures in the underworld, would organise the meeting, ensuring that no one felt left out or slighted. The meeting would take place in Atlantic City, under the control of the city's notorious boss, Enoch "Nookie" Johnson. Atlantic City was the perfect setting for such a crucial summit, a popular vacation destination known for its seaside boardwalk, gambling, and loose morals. The hotel president was chosen as the venue, and the invitations went out signed by Frenchie, whose name carried weight and trust in criminal circles. The meeting was meant to be discreet. No one wanted to risk the wrath of Joe the Boss Masseria. When the day arrived, the city was filled with bulletproof limousines carrying the biggest names in organised crime. From New York, the contingent was led by Luciano, Costello and Owney. Al Capone also made the trip, bringing his key lieutenants, Paul the waiter Rika and Jake Greasy Thumb Guzzo. Other major figures, including Boo Boo Hoff from Philadelphia, Mo Daltz from Cleveland and John Lazier from Kansas City, joined the gathering. Together, they represented the most powerful figures in the underworld. All were present, except for Masseria, who, despite the pressure, refused to attend. The Atlantic City Crime Convention would go down in history as the moment when the major criminal factions in America tried to find common ground. It was a peace meeting in a time of war, and it marked a turning point in the criminal underworld's history. Capone instructed one of his aides to arrange for a photograph of him and his host, Nucky Johnson, strolling arm in arm along the Atlantic City boardwalk. But behind the smiles, trouble was brewing. Big Al, suspicious that the entire convention might be aimed at him, nearly walked out before the proceedings even began. With personal annual earnings of $10 million, he was deeply wary of any moves that might threaten his empire. Eventually, the gangsters gathered around the massive mahogany conference table beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the hotel president for their historic meeting. The group agreed to form a national crime commission, uniting 24 major gangs under a single banner. The rules were clear: no one could be killed without a majority vote, and no law enforcement, journalists or civilians were to be harmed. The goal was to attract as little attention as possible, and the seasoned gangsters around the table knew this was a collective rebuke of Capone's aggressive methods. The consensus was clear. Capone had become too reckless, turning public sentiment and political favour against them. He needed to be shown as repentant. Capone, infuriated, stormed out of the meeting, his entourage in tow, slamming the door behind them. 2 days later, after lengthy negotiations between his lawyers and the authorities, Big Al was arrested for carrying a gun and sentenced to a year in prison. This marked a significant moment in the rise of the National Crime Commission. The remaining hours of the meeting were devoted to planning future operations, with discussions about legitimate investments in distilleries and breweries post-Prohibition, as well as expanding into nationwide gambling. If the Commission's framework worked as planned, the next logical step would be to establish a national crime syndicate. Before the meeting adjourned, Owney was called to the front to receive a commemorative watch in recognition of his exemplary leadership. As 1930 approached, New York seemed to hang on the brink of a world-changing shift. Much like the tense atmosphere before World War I, the first signs had appeared a year earlier. On Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market crashed, but many refused to acknowledge the warning signs. Financial experts attempted to calm the panic, but their efforts failed as small investors, driven by fear, flooded the stock exchange. The trading floor descended into chaos as panic-stricken investors jostled and screamed, trying to salvage what they could. The following week, the market collapsed entirely. More than 16 million shares were traded, causing billions in losses. Stock prices plummeted, and the wealth of Wall Street's elite vanished overnight. Some, unable to bear the loss, chose suicide over financial ruin. The Great Depression had arrived, leaving banks shuttered, factories closed, and millions unemployed. In New York, a grim joke circulated: do you want the hotel room for sleeping or jumping? Despite the economic devastation, Owney's business remained largely unaffected. The wealthy few who still had money flocked to his clubs, seeking solace in the vibrant atmosphere of jazz, dancing, and bootleg liquor, offering a brief escape from the harsh reality of the outside world. In many ways, Owney recognized this need for distraction, recalling his own youth, escaping the tough life in Liverpool through the opulence of music halls. He provided a retreat for those in need, but the shifting public sentiment was uncomfortable for him. The Depression gave rise to a new moral outlook that condemned the excesses of the gangster lifestyle, once seen as exciting and glamorous. In March 1930, newly appointed Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas E. Dewey began taking aim at New York criminals, planning to indict them on tax evasion, something that his colleagues in Chicago were having success with in their pursuit of putting Al Capone behind bars. Dewey, with the help of Treasury agents, focused first on bootlegger Waxy Gordon, who ran a lucrative operation using hidden pipelines to transport beer. When Waxy was convicted of tax evasion, it was a warning to others. Organised crime was a suffocating, high-stakes world, as more ambitious individuals and rebellious figures emerged in the cramped 22.7 square miles of Manhattan. Gang life became increasingly less enjoyable. For Owney Madden, a man as tough as they came, but with a level of refinement that many of his peers lacked, the pressure was taking its toll. He began to feel increasingly anxious, his nerves worn thin by the shifting power dynamics. His smoking grew heavier, and he started voicing concerns about the evolving political landscape. The signs were there, he could sense the vultures gathering, but for the first time he felt powerless to stop it. His long-standing stomach issues worsened, severely impacting his health. Late in 1930, Owney was driven to Sing Sing prison, where Dr. Sweet operated on his ulcerated bullet wounds, still giving him trouble 20 years after the Arbor dance hall shooting. His recovery was slow and painful, adding to the mounting stress. At the same time, the predicted threat of the reckless Vincent Cole, who was hell-bent on power, began to throw his weight around in the New York underworld. Born in County Kildare, Cole had immigrated to the US, where he grew up as an orphan in the harsh environment of Hell's Kitchen. He had a criminal record dating back to his teenage years, marked by burglaries, robberies, and stints in reformatories. Cole's path eventually led him to work for Dutch Schultz, who employed him to protect his beer trucks. Though Cole proved himself an efficient enforcer, Schultz quickly realised that his young charge was both too reckless and too ambitious to be controlled. Cole's habit of staging his own robberies, such as the heist at Sheffield Farms Dairy in the Bronx where he made off with $18,000, pushed Schultz to his breaking point. When Cole arrogantly demanded a partnership instead of his meagre salary, Schultz angrily refused, telling him he could either continue working for wages or leave. Cole chose the latter, leaving Schultz unsettled. As Cole's boldness grew, he increasingly took matters into his own hands, challenging the very gangs that had once controlled New York's underworld. By May 1930, he had evaded multiple charges and was wreaking havoc in Schultz and Madden's territories. To rein him in, Schultz sent a messenger to Cole with a deadly ultimatum: cease all bootlegging activities or face death. Cole, undeterred, shifted his focus to extorting the very gangsters who had once been his allies. Owney, known for his generosity, became his prime target. Cole began planning the kidnapping of big Frenchie Demonge, confident that Madden would pay any price to ensure his friend's safety. Kidnapping was becoming a lucrative but risky business in the criminal world, despite being frowned upon by most major figures. By 1931, it was estimated that there were 2,000 professional kidnappers operating in the underworld, generating millions in ransom. Though risky, it was a growing trend, and Cole, with his blend of ambition and ruthlessness, saw an opportunity to profit. On the evening of June 15th, 1931, Cole and his trusted gunman, Frank Giordano, ambushed Frenchie as he walked to his club Argonaut on West 50th Street. Cole, hiding a gun under his overcoat, ordered Frenchie into a waiting car and the two men took off toward Westchester County. As the car sped along, Cole set the ransom at $100,000, but Frenchie, ever the pragmatist, argued the sum was too high given the economic climate of the Depression. After a tense negotiation, they settled on a figure, $50,000. By the time Owney learned of Frenchie's disappearance, the ransom was already set and the clock was ticking. Madden, ever the negotiator, played it cool, offering $35,000 in cash when Cole arrived at his office. Cole, eager for the money, accepted the sum, though he made no secret of his contempt for Owney's offer. "That was very unwise, Vincent," Owney warned as Cole left with the cash, but the Irishman simply grinned, undeterred. The next morning, Frenchie was dumped on the street outside his club, unharmed but shaken. He returned to the Cotton Club, where Owney, still disturbed by the events, was already making plans to retaliate. Dutch Schultz, now fully aware of Cole's dangerous ambition, went into hiding, fearing that the young gangster might try the same tactic with him. Meanwhile, Owney dispatched his own men to search for Cole, but the elusive criminal had already vanished into the shadows. Cole's next move came on July 28, 1931, when he sent a clear message to Schultz, signalling his intent to take over more of his territory. Cole and his crew hunted down Joey Rao, one of Dutch's key gambling operators in Spanish Harlem. Cole's men fired on Rao in broad daylight, killing a child in the crossfire and sending shock waves through the city. The media dubbed him the Mad Dog and Baby Killer, and Cole became New York's most wanted man. Despite the public outcry, the political machine, still wary of the influence of gangsters, kept its distance. But Cole's reputation as a brutal and unpredictable killer made him more dangerous than ever. Owney and Schultz, both deeply shaken, each offered a $25,000 bounty for Cole's death, but the Irishman had already gone underground when the assassins went looking. In a twist of irony, it was the police who eventually located Cole hiding in a West 23rd Street hotel. Despite his best efforts to evade capture, Cole and Giordano were indicted for the murder of the 5-year-old boy. Their lawyer, Samuel J. Leibowitz, found a way to discredit the prosecution's key witness, who was found to have given perjured testimony in the past. With the case collapsing, Cole walked free and his fate seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear. In the world of organised crime, he had proven himself to be a force to be reckoned with. After spending several days contemplating his next move, Vincent Cole intensified his efforts to strike back at Dutch Schultz and Owney Madden with the boldest plans he'd yet devised. On the surface, it seemed that Owney was the more reserved of the two gangsters, and Cole, wrongly assuming that meant Owney was the weaker one, decided to challenge him directly. Schultz had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed, often retaliating with all-out force, while Owney, as Cole had observed during the ransom incident, was quieter, more withdrawn, and appeared to be easily pushed around. Unfortunately for Cole, he hadn't yet learned that first impressions could be misleading. Having been financially drained by the costly legal fees from his trial, Cole opted for a daring plan. He would kidnap the Duke, Owney Madden himself. Knowing his operation was leaking like a sieve, Cole even called Owney ahead of time to deliver his ultimatum. He told Owney that unless he paid $100,000 by a set deadline, he would be snatched from the streets and held for ransom. Owney, baffled by the audacity of the threat, hung up without saying a word. Things moved swiftly after that. A meeting was arranged with several other gang leaders, including Schultz and Frank Costello, at one of Owney's quiet midtown hotels to discuss the Cole situation. They decided to focus on one of Cole's bodyguards, known to be susceptible to bribery, in the hopes of extracting crucial information. Meanwhile, the city was divided into zones manned by gunmen ready to take down Cole the moment he was located. Those present at the meeting were determined to neutralise Cole's reckless actions without escalating to an all-out war in the streets, a task that proved far more difficult than anticipated, and their planned execution of Cole was a typical gangland killing. For days, Cole remained inactive, but his whereabouts were eventually discovered and discreetly monitored. His hiding place was the Cornish Arms Hotel at 311 West 23rd Street, and his daily activities were reported back to Schultz and Madden, who crafted a plan of action. They set Cole's execution date for February 8, 1932, and decided to lure him into a trap by sending a message through his bodyguard, implying that Owney was willing to discuss the $100,000 ransom. The intention was to make Cole believe that a conversation about the ransom was imminent, removing any suspicion of an ambush. The location chosen for this rendezvous was a drugstore on West 23rd Street, just off 8th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, an area Cole knew well and one where he felt at home. What he didn't realise, however, was that this drugstore was only a block and a half away from Owney's penthouse. On February 8th, Cole and his bodyguard left the Cornish Arms Hotel and walked to the drugstore, unaware that their fate was sealed. Inside, pharmacist Morris Kantrowitz was chatting with two customers when Cole entered. After scanning the room, Cole entered the telephone booth at the back of the store. Just as Cole was making the call, a car pulled up outside, driven by Bo Weinberg, one of Dutch Schultz's trusted men. Cole, oblivious to the approaching danger, continued his phone call for several minutes. Inside the store, the atmosphere grew tense as the gunman, a calm and collected figure, entered, machine gun in hand. Cole's bodyguard, sensing the danger, quickly left the store. The gunman, ignoring the others in the shop, issued a calm but chilling command to the pharmacist and his customers to stay quiet. He then aimed his weapon at the phone booth and unleashed a burst of bullets. The marksman's attack was so accurate and calculated that Cole was left on the floor, riddled with bullets. The gunman quickly fled to the waiting car and they sped off towards 8th Avenue. In the aftermath, the brutal efficiency of the hit would be analysed for years, a testament to the cold precision of gangland assassinations. Following the execution of Mad Dog Cole, the heat in New York reached an unbearable peak. Owney Madden knew it was time to escape. The safest refuge for a man in his position was Hot Springs, Arkansas. This spa town drew millionaires, movie stars and high society from all over the world. The Arlington Hotel's marbled lobby and the Majestic's grand facade were frequented by notable figures across America. Visitors could enjoy fine opera at the Hot Springs Opera House, dance to well-known bands, and gamble at the Belvedere or Southern Club. At a time when Las Vegas and Miami were still far from their modern glitz, Hot Springs gleamed like a jewel amidst the surrounding mountains. Bathhouses lined Central Avenue, offering healing waters to the weary, while the underworld also found solace here. Many visitors were unaware that men like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had made the town their hideout. Mayor Leo Patrick McLaughlin, a dictatorial lawyer of Irish descent, hadn't invited these figures, but once he approved their presence, they were free to lay low, conduct business, or avoid the law. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, criminals arriving at the Hot Springs station simply instructed the cab driver, "Take me to the cigar store." The white front cigar store, run by the tough and friendly Dick Galatas, doubled as a casino, pool hall, bookie shop and underground meeting spot. Visitors could find out who was in town or even arrange to purchase a gun from the local chief of detectives, Dutch Akers. The town, affectionately nicknamed Bubbles by the underworld, was a favourite haunt of Al Capone. He first arrived to buy liquor for his Chicago speakeasies from local bootleggers who distilled moonshine in the nearby hills. Some of the liquor was produced by three local families, often described as hillbillies by historians, who made as much as $25 million a year during Prohibition. Capone, always with a large entourage, would demand room 442 at the Southern Club, a room overlooking the street where his business associates could meet. Mayor McLaughlin, who ruled unopposed for 2 decades, didn't mind the notorious figures strolling through the town. As long as they brought money to Hot Springs, they were welcome. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had begun to take its toll on the town. The grand annual street pageant and horse racing at Oaklawn Park were casualties of the era, and businesses began closing their doors for the first time in years. Agnes Denby, a 30-year-old attractive woman who had recently struggled with the lack of business at her shop, was struggling to keep her head above water in such testing times. One afternoon, as she sat at the back of her shop, she spotted something unusual through the window. A sleek, gleaming Duesenberg convertible, more extravagant than anything she had ever seen, parked right outside. 2 men stepped out stretching as they surveyed the town. The driver, dressed casually for the countryside, glanced at the sign above the shop and strolled in. He was slight, with a shy, boyish smile and an accent that intrigued her immediately. As they stood across from each other at the counter, neither could have known how their lives would soon change. It wasn't by chance that Owney Madden had walked into Agnes's shop that day. Dutch Schultz had told him to look out for the good-looking dame when he arrived in Hot Springs. It was Owney's first visit to the town after hearing so much about it from the New York crowd. Owney complimented her and asked her if she would like to go for dinner one night. Agnes told him that she wasn't sure as her mother wasn't well. The real reason was that she had suspicions that Owney was a gangster and was fearful of her father, the city's postmaster, not approving. Owney told her that was fine, but if she was to change her mind, she could find him at the Arlington Hotel. Later that night, Agnes, lost in her thoughts, made up her mind. She changed into something more flattering, fixed her hair and makeup, and walked to the Arlington to meet the man she couldn't stop thinking about. When she found him in the lobby, she asked, "Hello, do you still want to go to dinner?" Owney flashed a wide grin and eagerly agreed. "I'd love to," he replied. They dined at a local restaurant that served chicken dinners and talked for hours as if the world had disappeared around them. Owney stayed in Hot Springs for over 2 weeks, and during that time, they grew closer. They dined, played golf against the breathtaking backdrop of forests and mountains, and went on drives. Their romance blossomed in the quiet town, but as they became absorbed in each other, the city of Hot Springs seemed to fade into the background. When Owney's visit was drawing to a close, he explained that he had to return to New York for an important fight that one of his boxers was preparing for. Before he left, he handed Agnes an envelope. When she opened it, she found a train ticket to New York. "I want you to visit me after the summer," he told her. This time, Agnes didn't hesitate. She said yes. Meanwhile, back in New York, Owney's business affairs were attracting unwanted attention. In his absence, rumours swirled and stories about his operations became wildly distorted. Law enforcement began targeting everyone connected to him. Fight manager Bill Duffy, a partner in the managing of boxers, found himself under scrutiny after his criminal past was exposed. Despite his checkered history, Duffy had been granted a boxing license in New York, illegally, and the press wasted no time publishing scandalous details about his earnings. Owney's business, though largely legitimate compared to some of the more nefarious underworld operations, was now under the microscope. Ambitious prosecutors saw an opportunity to make a name for themselves by taking down someone as influential as Owney Madden. In the tumultuous year of 1932, New York streets were more battlefield than city, where ambition and the drive for supremacy often overshadowed notions of good and evil. Owney Madden, however, had long since made his choice. Years earlier, he had decided that all he wanted was to survive, unscathed and unnoticed, and at this moment his life had taken an unexpected turn, one he did not see as a setback but as something new. He had fallen in love. Just a few weeks prior, Agnes seemed the least likely candidate for a whirlwind romance. She had all the qualities expected of a young woman from a respectable family destined for marriage to a man of good prospects. She was 18, fresh out of Hot Springs High School, and had big dreams for her future. At nearly 40, Owney's lifestyle was a world apart from hers, marked by the shadow of crime, while Agnes was entering a new phase of life, celebrating her graduation and hoping for a future of her own design. By the time Salvatore Maranzano, the mafia boss, was gunned down so Lucky Luciano could form the commission, Agnes had already become the object of Owney's affections. It was a romance that, for all its improbability, was blossoming rapidly. Their letters exchanged during his absence were infrequent, but warm. Owney, who was naturally reticent, expressed affection without revealing the full extent of the trouble he was facing in the underworld. The authorities, fueled by an increasing drive to control crime, began harassing Owney, holding him on minor charges in order to intimidate him. Sometimes they kept him in custody for as long as 48 hours until his lawyer, Joe Shalek, could secure his release. When Owney was released, Agnes made the trip to New York and they were finally reunited. Yet Owney, ever the cautious and self-preserving figure, insisted she be chaperoned by Texas Guinan, the notorious queen of the nightclubs, to keep her out of harm's way in the dangerous world he inhabited. During their brief time together, Agnes found herself swept up in New York's nightlife, drinking in speakeasies, attending Broadway shows, and experiencing a world far beyond anything she had known in Arkansas. She was treated to luxury, from jewelry bought at Tiffany's to front row tickets to the latest performances, but the most glaring absence was Owney's constant presence. His responsibilities kept him distant as investigations into organised crime, including New York's laundry rackets, were stirring up trouble. As the authorities grew more focused on his activities, Owney knew the time had come to disappear from public view again. Owney explained to Agnes he had to leave. He knew that Agnes, despite her pain, was not yet ready for the full truth of his life. She was a world away from understanding the complexities and dangers of his existence, but Owney had hoped that, in time, he would make it up to her. As she took the train back to Arkansas, he was already on a journey of his own, his next steps leading him toward California, where the stakes were higher than ever. In California, Owney's old friend George Raft had found his own success in Hollywood, starring in Scarface in 1932, a film based on the life of Al Capone. Raft's portrayal of the infamous gangster was so convincing that real mobsters started showing up at the studio. One of them relayed a message to George telling him the big man wants to see you. With some trepidation, George Raft arrived at the Lexington Hotel, Al Capone's downtown headquarters. To his relief, Capone seemed amused by the film. The two talked for a while, and just as George was about to leave, Capone called him back. "Georgie," he said, "I saw you tossing a coin throughout the movie." "Just a little theatrical trick," George replied, unsure if he'd upset anyone. "A 4-bit piece, right?" Capone asked. "No, it was a nickel," George answered. Capone shook his head. "That's worse. Tell them if any of my boys are tossing coins, they'll be using $20 gold pieces." Raft had only taken the role by chance. Before the movie, Owney had offered him 2 jobs, either touring Florida with Primo Carnera to drum up business ahead of a title fight or to star in a movie he had interest in. George opted for the movie instead, a decision that turned out to be a pivotal moment in his career. His first film, Queen of the Nightclubs, starring Texas Guinan, had already shown signs of Owney's influence in Hollywood. 2 years later, in 1932, George received his first starring role in Night After Night, a film in which Owney passed up the chance to cast Texas Guinan as the female lead, instead choosing Mae West, an old friend. Owney stayed with George during this time, and now in a position to return the favour, George insisted on taking him out on the town. Their excursions through the fashionable, mob-owned nightclubs quickly caught the attention of the local gossip columnists and, more problematically, the police. Before long, it was widely known that the Duke was in Los Angeles, and he was soon being treated like a celebrity. The authorities, however, were less than thrilled. Baron Fitz, the Los Angeles district attorney, decided Owney was unwelcome and ordered his arrest. When a squad of officers arrived at George's home, Owney had already disappeared. As the search for Owney intensified, he lay low with another friend who had recently moved into the area. Mae West, thrilled to see him again, hid Owney in her newly acquired deluxe apartment for almost a week. Despite her joy at their reunion, Mae had to spend much of her time doing rounds at the studios, and Owney soon began to feel like a prisoner, cooped up all day. Not content to remain idle, he reached out to George, who suggested they go out for the evening. However, the club they chose had a doorman who also worked part-time as a policeman. Recognizing Owney from a wanted poster, the doorman discreetly dropped a nickel into the payphone. Owney was soon arrested. When the officers tried to question him, he refused to identify himself, fearing a parole violation. George Raft soon turned up and posted the $10,000 bail. After his arrest, Owney decided to spend the next few weeks traveling the country to reconnect with old friends. Word of his run-in with the law had already reached the state parole board in New York, signaling more trouble on the horizon. He stayed for 2 weeks in Hot Springs once more with the new love of his life, Agnes. They spent the days riding, playing golf, and parading around the lavish bars and nightclubs. The days seemed to slip by quickly, and Owney knew the time had come for him to return to New York, where he would once again face the battle against the authorities to stay out of prison. They spent Christmas and New Year's Eve apart. Agnes had dinner with older family members while Owney took in the festivities at the Cotton Club and the Stork Club. As the bells tolled in the new year of 1933, both of them felt a sense of foreboding. Owney, once considered the most peaceful of New York's organised crime leaders, was now certain to be the next target for a trip to Sing Sing. A Christmas telegram Owney sent to Hot Springs would be the last Agnes would receive from him for almost 2 months. Thomas E. Dewey, a name that Owney would become all too familiar with, ordered parole board staff to work through the Christmas holidays to find grounds for sending the Duke back to prison. Dewey was under heavy pressure to build a solid case, but struggled to find any substantial evidence that Owney had broken the law. 2 key anomalies surfaced during the investigation. Unlike other parolees, Owney had never been asked to report to the parole board, and there was a great deal of mystery surrounding his supposed employment. When Owney had been questioned about his work upon returning from Hot Springs, he claimed to be involved in both the cereal and laundry businesses. Yet, an audit of his income tax returns revealed no such ties to either industry. This discrepancy piqued the interest of the Treasury Department's intelligence unit, which had already begun investigating his tax affairs. Owney was facing mounting pressure from multiple angles. The possibility of deportation to England was no longer a priority, as the legal requirements for deportation were too strict. Instead, the government was focused on removing him from New York. The Treasury Department had uncovered that Owney owed $73,553 in additional taxes and penalties, and with the momentum from Waxy Gordon's prosecution, the authorities were determined to bring Owney down. In late January, the authorities turned their attention to the Hydrox Laundry in Brooklyn, where Owney had claimed to be employed. The authorities had no time to lose. The warrants were delivered at high speed to Commissioner Mulrooney, who immediately dispatched a special squad of detectives to track down the wanted men. Owney, described in the New York Times the next day as one of the city's toughest gangsters, was arrested the night of February 12th, 1933. At the time of his arrest, Owney claimed to be working as an investigator for a coal company. He was arrested outside his home and, after a brief appearance in the lineup, was taken to the Tombs, where he would await trial. As Owney sat in the Tombs, The parole board wasted no time in preparing to return him to Sing Sing. Owney was treated with respect as he had been in his younger days and was given a cell to himself. The authorities were determined to make an example of Owney. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, as reporters speculated on his treatment in prison, his attorney Joe Shalek was preparing to fight his case. The legal proceedings were set for the following Monday. Despite Shalek's defence, the legal system was stacked against Owney. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the authorities were committed to putting him back in prison. This battle was far from over. Owney passed over $250,000 to Jimmy Hines to spread around Tammany Hall and gave Frank Costello $100,000 to give to the judge, and Owney walked free. The mob's influence on the Democratic Party was now clear to see, but Thomas Dewey wasn't going to let Owney walk away that easily. Dewey appealed to the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, urging him to reconsider the case. Roosevelt, with ambitions for a presidential run and eager to demonstrate a firm stance on organised crime, agreed to revisit it and issued a warrant for Owney's arrest. To build a strong case, he enlisted the support of J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, forming a formidable alliance against Owney. Upon learning of the warrant, Owney promptly pleaded guilty. He sought to avoid the intense media attention and a public spectacle that had surrounded his previous trial. Exhausted by the relentless pursuit of the authorities, his strategy was to serve a year in prison, believing it would lead them to ease their focus on him. On July 7th, 1932, Owney bid Agnes farewell at his New York penthouse and climbed into a waiting car, which silently drove towards Sing Sing. The New York Times reported, Madden drove up to the prison gates with 2 other men. He shook hands with the occupants before alighting. As he walked toward the gates, the car turned and disappeared in the direction of New York City. The scene was almost cinematic. Owney, dressed in a light suit and straw hat, walked slowly toward the gates, his old bullet wounds still bothering him. He was the only man ever to voluntarily surrender at Sing Sing. When he reached the gate, the new guard didn't recognize him. "What do you want?" the guard asked suspiciously. "The name's Owney Madden. I believe the warden has a cell waiting for me." The guard, thinking it was a prank, told him to leave. It wasn't until Owney saw Clement Furling, the warden's secretary, that his identity was confirmed. Furling had known Owney from his previous sentence and ordered the guard to open the gate. Warden Laws greeted Owney warmly, offering him supper, which Owney politely declined. The gates closed behind him with a chilling finality, signalling the capture of the Duke of the West Side. Owney did not adjust well to his return behind bars. Though other prisoners treated him like a celebrity, he withdrew into the privacy of his cell, earning the nickname Owney the Hermit. Agnes remained in New York for a while after Owney turned himself in, staying with Texas Guinan. At first, she felt closer to him being around his old haunts than when back in Arkansas. There was a sense of finality to his imprisonment that Agnes was reluctant to accept. At this point, neither Owney nor Agnes realised that a new chapter was about to begin for both of them. For the time being, their separation brought about deteriorating health for both. Some even considered it miraculous that Owney had survived as long as he had after the Arbor dance hall shooting, and only his toughness, something Mae West had found so appealing, kept him alive. Dr. Sweet from Sing Sing's hospital expressed serious concern, stating, "Madden is dangerously ill. Enemies used their guns on him at times, causing a serious intestinal condition. The ailment has recurred from time to time. He has just been operated on. He is in serious condition." As the weeks passed, Owney recovered and began to regain his strength. Warden Laws, recognising Owney's gradual improvement, encouraged him to take up horticulture. Owney spent his time tending to the prison's flower beds and working in the greenhouses, gradually improving through gentle exercise. After a long, bleak winter of illness and depression, the arrival of spring seemed to lift his spirits. By Easter 1934, Sing Sing proudly announced, The lilies on the chapel's altar for Easter services have been grown by convict Owney Madden, famed Manhattan beer baron. Unlike many prisoners, Owney could have wielded significant influence in Sing Sing, but he chose to lead a quiet life. His second stint in prison seemed to be softening his character. Flowers and reading became his primary interests, and he managed to turn Sing Sing into a kind of sanctuary where he could recover and plan his next moves. He received news that his sister Mary had passed away in New York City, and his grief was profound. Owney had always maintained close ties with his family, especially his mother and siblings, and he was allowed a day's release with a guard to attend Mary's funeral. When word spread that Owney was to appear at St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church, thousands of friends, neighbours and associates gathered to welcome him. Owney's conduct in prison remained exemplary, and regular bulletins confirmed his good behaviour. He had, as Warden Laws put it, become a model prisoner. As the end of his year-long sentence neared, Owney successfully convinced the parole board that he had secured a $1.50 a week job as a checker with the Champion Coal Company. The board, which had once been determined to see him locked away, now appeared to undergo a remarkable shift in attitude, even expressing sympathy for his declining health. On July 1st, 1934, Owney walked out of Sing Sing and into the sunlight, his first steps toward freedom. As he moved toward a waiting green limousine, the door slammed behind him and the vehicle sped off toward Manhattan's distant skyline. Officially, the terms of Owney's parole ordered him to stay in New York City, to which he ignored. At first, he travelled back and forth between Arkansas and Manhattan, taking care to avoid drawing attention to his absence from the underworld scene. While he made occasional business trips, Owney's movements didn't go entirely unnoticed, leading to mounting pressure on the parole board to explain his apparent freedom. In September 1934, just 3 months after his release, Owney visited San Francisco, reportedly buying interest in West Coast racetracks. A police officer recognised him, and the alarm bells began to ring. A police chief, who had grown uneasy, decided to double-check Owney's identity before taking action. Meanwhile, far from the streets of San Francisco, J. Edgar Hoover was hard at work, his executive office dimly lit by the grim visage of John Dillinger's death mask on the wall. Sitting behind a desk that seemed as imposing as a tombstone, Hoover pored over reports and cables, leaving nothing to chance. Nothing escaped his sharp gaze, not even the smallest details. A report had come in that the police chief was seeking Owney's identification, and Hoover immediately dispatched Special Agent Reed Vetterli to investigate if Owney was in San Francisco. After an uncomfortable meeting, Vetterli returned to Hoover's office with a photograph of Madden the chief of police had taken before letting him go. Hoover, never one to tolerate incompetence, was furious. He demanded answers and chastised his department for failing to act on such an obvious threat. The director's anger was palpable in the memo he sent out. I am still at a loss to understand why the identification unit did not recognise the case of Owney Madden. His reputation is nearly as well known as that of Al Capone. At least someone in the department should have recognised his name. Owney managed to slip past the FBI and returned once more to Hot Springs. There, he and Agnes shared a happiness that had long eluded them. Owney's relationship with Agnes would prove pivotal in shaping his future, with their bond playing an essential role in his next phase. A few months later, Prohibition was officially repealed. After just 8 months in office, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Proclamation 2065, effectively lifting the Volstead Act and ending America's experiment with alcohol prohibition. In New York, the celebration was palpable, with speakeasies buzzing as patrons raised glasses. Effigies of Prohibition were burned, drowned, and even shot, while the demand for beer skyrocketed. Breweries scrambled to meet the new demand, and beer trucks could be seen delivering to iconic locations like the Empire State Building. In contrast, drugstores saw their beer sales far surpass coffee orders, illustrating the overwhelming thirst that had returned to America. By 1934, beer consumption surged from 27.5 million barrels in 1919 to more than 32 million, a striking indication of the national thirst that Prohibition had only fueled. This shift in the nation's legal and cultural landscape was a turning point for organised crime. Owney, once a member of an unsophisticated street gang, had risen to become a master strategist in bootlegging and was now positioned at the cusp of a new era of criminal enterprise. As Prohibition ended, new opportunities opened up, and Owney's rise in the underworld mirrored the changing dynamics in New York. Corrupt Mayor Walker's resignation paved the way for Fiorello LaGuardia, the fiery new mayor known as Little Flower, who immediately set about cracking down on crime, including smashing slot machines with a sledgehammer in a public spectacle. While many gangsters scrambled to adapt to this new era, Owney, like Frank Costello, shifted his focus to victimless crimes, in this case, gambling. Gambling was illegal across much of the country, but a savvy network of gangsters had begun to seize control of casinos and racetracks, and Owney was no exception. Hot Springs, Arkansas, a town largely immune to national laws, became a prime target. Owney saw an opportunity to expand and solidify his interests in the gambling world, free from the constraints of New York's increasingly aggressive law enforcement. The deal to take control of Hot Springs, shrouded in secrecy, would have been nothing short of monumental. Those who were privy to the negotiations remained tight-lipped about the details, but it's widely believed that Owney's move involved multiple high-level agreements and large sums of money. It's estimated that around $1 million exchanged hands between High Court officials and Owney's representatives to transfer his parole. The proposed deal would secure Owney's future in Hot Springs, but come with strict conditions. He would be allowed to operate freely there as long as he stayed within the town and refrained from interfering with those in power. Owney's parole was transferred to Hot Springs, and if he left the state, he would face immediate incarceration. For his part, he quietly accepted the terms. The life he envisioned in Arkansas alongside Agnes seemed like a peaceful retreat from the unrelenting pressures of New York. In New York, Frank Costello took over Owney's business interests, managing operations in the city while Owney settled in Hot Springs. However, the arrangement was far from simple. Even as Owney enjoyed relative freedom in his new home, the wheels of justice continued to turn against him. The deal that allowed him to live out his days in Arkansas, though seen as a victory of sorts, was far from a guarantee of peace. The relentless pursuit of justice by prosecutors, uninterested in the political deals that protected Owney, set the stage for a final chapter in his life where he would be hunted until his death. Owney attended a secret meeting held in early 1935 at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The gathering, behind the locked doors of a conference suite, involved most of the 132 delegates who had attended the Atlantic City Convention. Leading crime figures discussed their strategy for the future, addressing the shifting landscape of organised crime. Notable absentees included Waxy Gordon and Al Capone, both incarcerated for tax evasion, and Dutch Schultz, who was hiding from the law and facing scrutiny from prosecutor Thomas Dewey. There were several pressing issues at hand. The high-profile Lindbergh baby kidnapping had drawn unwanted attention to organised crime. Mayor LaGuardia had launched an aggressive campaign against Frank Costello's slot machines and, just moments after taking office, had ordered Lucky Luciano's arrest. Amidst these tensions, the assembled crime bosses, sharply dressed and poised, voted to set up their own regional councils. The formation of the National Crime Syndicate aimed at spreading influence across the country with mutual cooperation rather than competition, as Longy Zwillman, a New Jersey gangster, put it. We just can't afford to have people bumping off anybody they please or kidnapping big shots. We've got to have control and cooperation. It isn't like it used to be when it was every man for himself. We've got to learn to act like businessmen. One of the final decisions of the meeting was the distribution of Dutch Schultz's territory as the crime boss faced inevitable jail time for tax evasion. Owney was awarded the lucrative Tropical Park racetrack in Miami for services rendered. As chairman, Meyer Lansky was responsible for allocating unclaimed territories around the country. Owney, whom Lansky trusted, was granted full control of Hot Springs. Meanwhile, Schultz, despite his efforts to avoid prosecution, was less than pleased when he learned of these decisions. After considering his options, he approached Lansky with an offer. If the syndicate agreed to eliminate Dewey, he would step down and relinquish his claim to his empire. If not, he threatened to take matters into his own hands and kill the prosecutor himself. The crime bosses deliberated and, by a majority, decided against assassinating Dewey. It would simply bring too much heat to their operations. Dutch Schultz threatened to assassinate Dewey himself and have it completed within 48 hours, which sealed his fate. Schultz was killed on orders of the National Crime Syndicate by Murder Inc., the murder-for-hire ally of the mob. Exiled from New York, Dutch and his crew were conducting business at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, when they were ambushed and shot by two gunmen. Dutch didn't due immediately, and in the hours before his death, Schultz rambled incoherently, yet occasionally poetically, as a stenographer took down his every word at his bedside. Among the disjointed phrases he muttered, he said, "They are Englishmen, and they are a type. I don't know who is best, they or us." Perhaps this was a hint to Owney. Dutch's final words have gone down in history, and he died on October the 25th, 1935, as a result of 4 gunshot wounds. Dutch was a relic of old New York, a city Owney was happy to leave behind, a city filled with ruthless figures like Patsy Doyle, Vincent Coll, Legs Diamond, and others whose greed and brutality threatened Owney's more measured approach to the criminal world. In contrast, Owney found comfort in the quiet, steady life he had built in Hot Springs with his wife, Agnes. There, in the small mountain town, he could enjoy a sense of peace and personal security that had eluded him in the chaotic underworld of New York. The transition from New York life wasn't without difficulty. Owney still had to remain discreet in his dealings with old underworld contacts. Hot Springs was under the surveillance of the FBI's Little Rock division, with J. Edgar Hoover determined to put the Duke behind bars, and with only a year left on his parole, Owney couldn't afford to jeopardize his freedom. In the first months of 1936, he spent time in New York managing the winding down of his operations. The media still followed his every move, hungry for any opportunity to report on his activities. On June 6th, the Associated Press reported, "The parole period of Owen Vincent Madden, pigeon fancier and horticulturist, ends June 15th at midnight, after which he will be free to come and go as he pleases." When the long-awaited day arrived marking the end of Owney's parole, the event was met with mixed reactions in the press, depending largely on the individual reporter's perspective of him. The lingering question, however, was how Owney had managed to turn the parole board's stance from relentless opposition to compassionate leniency. It is known that Jimmy Hines applied considerable political pressure to keep Owney out of Sing Sing. Hines's key ally during this time was Frank Costello, Owney's close friend, who believed fervently in the power of the bribe over the bullet. Once Owney was free from the constraints of parole, he began to turn his attention to the idea of marriage. Agnes, who had waited patiently for this moment, was finally set to marry him in April 1936. It was a crisp, bright morning, with the Ouachita Mountains outlined sharply against a clear blue sky. Owney had taken great care to keep the wedding plans secret, but somehow the news leaked out. New York's newspapers, divided between outrage at his manipulation of the parole board and a grudging affection for the city's most colourful character, pursued the story vigorously. They were married in secrecy at a beautiful resort near Mount Ida, just 12 miles northwest of Hot Springs, overlooking the Pine Ridge Hills. Hot Springs had a long history, dating back to when the Natchez tribe crossed the mountains to the sacred Valley of Vapors, drawn by the hot springs believed to have healing powers. They told stories of a dragon-like spirit that lived deep within a cave under a mountain. The tribes prayed to the Great Spirit, who destroyed the monster, and as it died, hot water gushed from the mountainside, creating the valley's famous springs. From that moment, the valley was considered sacred, a neutral ground where no warfare could take place. By 1936, Hot Springs remained a haven for those seeking refuge from the law, and its status as a safe haven hadn't changed much. It was still one of the safest places for anyone being pursued by federal authorities. The city's mayor, Leo McLaughlin, was a sharp and intelligent lawyer who loved money, horses, and women. Likely in that order. His greatest weakness, however, was his thirst for power. McLaughlin was fascinated by those who wielded influence. Owney, a man who exuded power, quickly caught his attention. They struck up a business relationship, and Owney became part of McLaughlin's political machine, the Little Combination. McLaughlin, though, suspected that Owney was part of something even bigger. Having Owney in Hot Springs provided an additional benefit for the Little Combination, a reliable safeguard against outside threats. The town was constantly a target for gangs from across the country, and Owney's presence served as a crucial buffer against any unwelcome interference. In return, Owney was made one of the family and given the freedom to make unlimited investments. Information about newcomers or visitors was sent directly to the Duke to decide if they were welcome. Over the years, many were turned away at gunpoint by sheriff's officers, including Al Capone himself. When Capone was released from prison in 1939, he planned to visit Hot Springs for rest, but he forgot that Owney now ran the town. Capone was too well known for Owney, and he didn't want him around. Hot Springs was no longer a place for outsiders to catch up on underworld news unless they were connected. Owney, meanwhile, expanded his criminal empire, investing in gambling, hotels and entertainment venues, including the Southern and Belvedere clubs. He was affiliated with the National Crime Syndicate but preferred to stay in the background, despite being the most powerful man in Hot Springs. Owney didn't need protection, as local authorities felt they needed protection from him. Owney must have been relieved to be away from the political battles in New York, where Dewey was intensifying his efforts against organised crime, particularly targeting Lucky Luciano. Dewey's investigation involved a mass roundup of prostitutes, hoping to link Luciano to the crime ring. Dewey had assembled evidence against him, and Luciano went into hiding, eventually finding refuge in Hot Springs. He arrived there to find that Owney controlled not only the city but its police and judiciary. By April 1st, Luciano read in the papers that Dewey's grand jury had indicted him on 90 charges. Luciano, desperate for escape, sought shelter with Owney, who had established himself as a powerful figure with the means to protect him. A few days later, New York requested Luciano's arrest, which Hot Springs Police Chief Joe Wakelin wasn't eager to fulfill. Owney Madden reassured Luciano, arranging his release with a $5,000 bail from Owney's clubs. Dewey was furious, not understanding how Luciano could be freed in Hot Springs, but his pressure on local officials had little effect. Governor Marion Futrell tried to intervene, but Hot Springs police, loyal to Owney, refused to comply. Later, 5 carloads of state police arrived, demanding Luciano's surrender. With Owney's guidance, Hot Springs police stood down and Lucky was moved to Little Rock. There, state troopers guarded the courthouse while the extradition hearing took place. In May, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. His conviction shocked the underworld. Hot Springs' political system, fueled by bribery and protection money, kept business running smoothly. Owney, with his control over Arkansas, maintained strong ties to politicians, using influence to ensure his operations continued uninterrupted. By 1937, Owney had solidified his power in Hot Springs, while Luciano faced a grim future in prison. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover, who had little involvement in Luciano's arrest, faced increasing criticism from Congress. He sought vindication through the capture of Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, who had also been under Owney's protection in Hot Springs. Owney's old pals, Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, helped expand Hot Springs' gambling operations. The town's political machine was well oiled, with payoffs flowing to politicians at all levels. Owney's associates knew they could still find refuge in Hot Springs, and the system worked smoothly for all involved. The FBI, however, was suspicious of what went on behind the town's shiny facade. Hoover took interest in Madden and ordered regular reports on his movements from FBI agents based in nearby Little Rock. They initiated an undercover operation, building a network of informants to track Madden's activities. Their reports, though sparse, painted a mundane picture. Madden had been in Hot Springs for months, living with his wife. He spent most of his time at the White Front cigar store or playing golf. His personal car was a new Buick, and Mrs. Madden drove a 1938 Packard convertible coupe. Hoover, aware of Madden's cunning, wrote to Little Rock asking how seriously they were pursuing the case. The reply downplayed Madden's activities, stating he lived entirely within the law in Hot Springs and was known for charitable contributions. Owney enjoyed fostering the illusion of retirement, and many visitors were left convinced he had truly stepped back from his criminal past. Unlike many of his former associates who struggled with self-discipline and died young, Owney felt no need to prove himself. Occasionally, Owney did miss the excitement of New York. In May 1940, he briefly broke the terms of his parole to attend a boxing match at Madison Square Garden. With former associate Marty Krompier, Owney watched the fight before being arrested by detectives. At the police station, Owney joked he was just a mineral water salesman from the Midwest, but the authorities were clearly intent on reminding him of the seriousness of his parole. Despite no charges being filed, Owney spent the night in jail and was eventually released on a flimsy vagrancy charge. Back in Hot Springs, the FBI's investigation continued. Their reports described Madden as a fisherman with several boats, living a legitimate life with no apparent criminal activity. However, informants from Hot Springs hinted that Madden had plenty of money and interests, but kept them hidden under other names. This only fueled Hoover's desire to step up Operation Madden. Owney, aware of the FBI's scrutiny, made his daily routine as dull as possible to deter further investigation. Meanwhile, in Florida, authorities were looking into racetrack ownership, which led back to Owney. Tropical Park near Coral Gables had been renovated by Atlas Finance Company, whose owners had ties to Madden and his former partners. Though Madden's name didn't appear on the directors' list, it was clear he had a stake in the operation. As the US entered the war, Owney's British citizenship became a concern. In 1941, the FBI inquired about his alien registration, though Owney was unconcerned, having carried his British passport through worse situations. Owney's former associates, like Lucky Luciano, were helping with the war effort, but Owney felt no need to participate. He kept a low profile, following the news but staying out of the spotlight. Owney was known for his generosity with money, particularly at the Southern Grill, where he had a reserved table. If someone was seated there in his absence, especially a young couple or someone who looked poor, their meal was on the house. Despite being largely out of the public eye in Hot Springs, Owney still attracted media interest, receiving offers from Hollywood studios to make a film about his life. He ignored all such offers, including one from comedian Joey Lewis, who offered to portray him for a small fee. Owney, who had shied away from the spotlight his entire life, had no interest in becoming a movie subject. After the war, the political climate in Hot Springs shifted. A group of young veterans led by Sid McMath organised the GI revolt against the long-serving mayor Leo McLaughlin. With the backing of McMath's group, McLaughlin's corrupt machine was finally overthrown. The veterans fought to secure key positions in local government, including prosecutor and circuit judge, to weaken McLaughlin's power. Despite a heavily rigged election system, the veterans, with Owney's covert support, won. McMath would later recall that McLaughlin could have avoided defeat by stepping aside, but was too greedy. A grand jury investigation estimated that Hot Springs gambling houses made $30 million annually, though only $1.6 million in taxes were reported. McLaughlin's machine imposed fines of just $31,000, and it was suspected that law enforcement officials were being paid off by gamblers. After the election, most of Owney's business interests remained intact. Much of Owney's time was spent with friends from the underworld who enjoyed anonymity in Hot Springs. By the 1950s, as gambling once again faced political pressure, Owney began to consider retiring from the business. His decision to step back came amid rising political hostility, including a vocal campaign against gambling led by Walter Winchell. Owney, however, was not one to bow to pressure. In 1956, he began to divest from his interests in the Southern Club, selling off his stake to trusted associates. Despite the political opposition, Owney continued to pull strings behind the scenes, influencing the fate of his enterprises. By 1964, J. Edgar Hoover still wanted Owney behind bars. They resumed surveillance of the Duke and his seemingly dull daily routine. Instead of spending afternoons at the Southern Club, Owney now frequented the Ritter Hotel. The FBI cranked up their surveillance, following him in a Ford supplied by the Bureau. Around the same time, Owney ordered a new TV for his office from a local store, requesting the dealer to install the aerial. When the technician arrived and moved some old wires across the roof, he had no idea they were part of the wire service that Owney was running. He received the racing results in real time and then relayed them to 8 local bookmakers, charging a fee for his service. The next day, Owney introduced himself to the dealer and explained that those wires were crucial for the betting operation and ordered him to put them back in place. However, the Duke's time was coming to an end. Less than a year later, on February 17, 1965, Agnes summoned the family doctor to their home. Owney, weakened by a chest illness, was examined and confined to a wheelchair. The next day, a Thursday, marked the last time he left the White House on West Grand Avenue. By April 22nd, just days after Easter, Owney was admitted to St. Joseph's Hospital, pale and struggling to breathe. At 12:10 a.m. on April 24, 1965, the Duke of the West Side slipped away quietly. Despite the violent and unbelievable life he led, Owney peacefully passed away in his sleep, aged 73. In the federal building, J. Edgar Hoover filed his report. Owen Vincent Madden died of chronic emphysema. The Sentinel Record newspaper is receiving numerous calls from Eastern newspapers seeking background and photos. In England, the land where Owney had been born 73 years earlier, the press remembered his blazing underworld career of bootlegging and racketeering and acknowledged his later years of generous charitable contributions, particularly for youth causes. Among the mourners were honorary pallbearers who knew Owney well, including men from New Jersey, Chicago, St. Louis and New Orleans, as well as his good friend George Raft. It has been said there's much good in the worst of us and much bad in the best, Raft remarked. Owney's life proves that. He has no ballpark named after him, no silver cup bearing his name, but he is remembered in the hearts of those he helped, with his money, his actions and his words of support during dark times. Owney's legacy exists somewhere between the lines of good and bad. He was loved by friends and despised by enemies, but both for reasons that had little to do with right or wrong. One of his old friends, boxer turned gangster Mickey Cohen, summed up Owney's character. Owney was a man you could respect and admire. He was a man of his word all the way through. His loyalty to his own was his strongest trait. If Owney trusted you, he was loyal no matter what. The story of Owney Madden's life, especially his final years in Hot Springs, will never be known fully. Shy, private and cunning, he never gave interviews and shunned discussion of his past. Those who knew him have their own versions of his life, and though he was a cornerstone of American organised crime, he was also remembered as a kind, generous man to those who mattered. Thus brings an end to the story of Owney the Killer Madden, a man who epitomised organised crime from the gangs of New York turn of the 20th century era all the way through to the 1960s, where he still ran gambling operations well into his 70s. Thanks so much for watching, and please like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed.